In the dusty heart of Texas, 1875, a starving 10-year-old boy uttered three words that would change everything. Nobody cares. But across that sun-bleached street stood a cowboy who'd heard those same words echo in his own broken past. What happened next? A simple bowl of stew, a desperate teacher, and a journey into the unknown would forge an unbreakable bond between three lost souls. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment your city below so I can see how far this tale of hope and redemption travels across the world. The evening heat pressed down on Sweetwater Creek like a wool blanket soaked in creek water, heavy and suffocating despite the sun's retreat behind the western hills. The main street lay quiet in that peculiar stillness that comes just before darkness, when honest folks head home and the saloons begin to light their lamps. Dust hung suspended in the amber light, and somewhere down the road, a dog barked twice before falling silent. 10-year-old Eli Turner sat crumpled against the weathered boards of Morrison's general store, his back pressed against the rough wood as if he could disappear into it. His clothes, if they could still be called that, hung on his thin frame in tatters, the shirt so worn through that patches of sunburned skin showed through like windows in an abandoned house. His bare feet were caked with dirt and blood from walking the rocky streets without shoes, and his face bore the hollow look of a child who'd forgotten what it felt like to be full. The boy's stomach had stopped growling hours ago. Now it just ached, a deep, persistent pain that had become so familiar it felt like part of him, like the color of his eyes or the sound of his voice. He'd learned to ignore it mostly, the same way he'd learned to ignore the stares of townsfolk who stepped around him like he was a piece of furniture left out in the rain. "Nobody cares," Eli muttered to himself, drawing his knees up to his chest. His voice was barely audible, cracked and dry from thirst. Nobody cares about nothing. He'd tried the store earlier, just tried to slip in and maybe pocket an apple or a heel of bread, but old Morrison had spotted him before he'd made it past the doorway, his thick hand clamping down on Eli's shoulder like a bear trap. "Not again, you little rat," Morrison had bellowed, his face turning the color of a ripe tomato. "I've told you and told you, stay out of my store. You ain't got money, you don't come in. Simple as that." Morrison had dragged him outside by the scruff of his neck and tossed him into the street like a bag of garbage. Eli had landed hard in the dust, tasting dirt and defeat. A few passers-by had glanced over, but their eyes slid away just as quickly, uncomfortable with the sight of poverty and hunger that reflected poorly on their prosperous little town. "You hear me, boy?" Morrison had stood in his doorway, pointing a thick finger. "Next time I catch you sniffing around, I'll have Sheriff Hutchins lock you up. Now get!" That had been an hour ago. Eli had crawled back to his spot against the store wall, too tired and hungry to move further. He watched the street with dull eyes, seeing without really looking. A wagon rolled past, its wheels creaking. A woman in a blue dress hurried by, clutching her reticule close as she passed him. Two men in conversation crossed to the other side of the street rather than walk near him. "Nobody cares," he thought again. The words had become a rhythm in his head, beating in time with his heart. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. He didn't remember his parents clearly anymore. His mother's face was just a blur of warmth and a faint memory of singing. His father was even less, just a shadow that had left one day and never come back. He'd ended up at Mrs. Halstead's orphanage when he was 7, and that had been, well, it hadn't been good, but it hadn't been this either. Then 3 days ago, everything had changed. Mrs. Halstead had died suddenly, her heart, the doctor said, and the orphanage had been shut down. The children had been scattered like seeds in the wind, some claimed by distant relatives, others sent to orphanages in other towns. But Eli, nobody had wanted Eli. Too old, too wild, too much trouble, they said. So he'd run. Just ran into the streets of Sweetwater Creek and kept running until his legs gave out. He'd been surviving on scraps ever since, a discarded potato here, some apple cores from behind the hotel there. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The sun sank lower, painting the buildings in shades of orange and red. Soon it would be dark, and Eli would have to find somewhere to sleep. Maybe behind the livery stable again, if the stable master didn't chase him off. Maybe in the alley beside the bank where the wind didn't cut quite so sharp. He was contemplating this, planning his evening with the grim determination of someone much older than 10, when he noticed the cowboy. The man stood across the street, one boot on the boardwalk step, as if he'd been about to mount up to the saloon but had stopped mid-motion. He was tall, taller than most men Eli had seen, with broad shoulders and the weathered look of someone who spent his life under the sun. He wore dusty trail clothes, a battered hat pushed back on his head, and a gun belt slung low on his hips in the casual way of a man who knew how to use it but didn't need to prove it. But it wasn't his size or his gun that caught Eli's attention. It was the way the man was looking at him, not through him, like most folks did, not past him, pretending he didn't exist, but at him, really looking, with eyes that seemed to see more than just a dirty orphan boy against a wall. The cowboy's face was hard to read from this distance, shadowed by his hat brim, but something in his posture had changed. His jaw worked like he was chewing over a thought. His hands, which had been hanging loose at his sides, now clenched and unclenched slowly. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The street between them might as well have been a canyon, vast and impossible to cross. Eli felt something stir in his chest. Not hope, exactly. Hope had died 3 days ago, but maybe curiosity. What was this stranger thinking? Why was he staring? Then, just as Eli was about to look away, the cowboy made his decision. Instead of turning toward the saloon as he'd clearly intended, the man stepped off the boardwalk and started across the street. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, and he walked with the rolling gait of a man more comfortable in a saddle than on his own 2 feet. He was heading straight for Eli. The boy's first instinct was to run. Strangers who paid him attention usually meant trouble, adults who wanted to yell at him, chase him off, or worse. But something kept Eli frozen in place. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was something in the way the cowboy moved, without aggression or anger. Or maybe, deep down in a place Eli had tried to lock away, he was just desperate enough to hope this might be different. The cowboy crossed the street in a dozen long strides and stopped a few feet away. Up close, he was even more imposing. Easily over 6 feet tall, with sun-darkened skin and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting at distant horizons. He looked to be in his early 30s, though hard living could age a man fast out here. His face was rough-hewn but not unkind, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard. For a moment he just stood there, looking down at Eli with those steady gray-blue eyes. Then, slowly, carefully, as if approaching a skittish animal, he crouched down on his haunches so he was closer to the boy's level. "Son," the cowboy said quietly, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, "you look like you could use a friend." Eli stared at him suspiciously. Adults said things like that sometimes, but they never meant it. They'd ruffle your hair and call you son and then walk away feeling good about themselves while you stayed hungry. "Don't need nothing," Eli mumbled, looking away, especially not from strangers. The corner of the cowboy's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Fair enough. Name's Colt Dawson. Now I'm not a stranger, I'm Colt. What do they call you?" "They don't call me nothing," Eli said bitterly, "except when they're chasing me off or calling me rat or thief or—" "Your name, son," Colt interrupted gently. "What's your name?" Eli hesitated, then mumbled, Eli Turner." "Eli Turner," Colt repeated, as if testing the name and finding it satisfactory. "That's a good, strong name. Now, Eli Turner, I heard what you said before, about nobody caring." Eli's head snapped up, his eyes wide and defensive. He hadn't realized anyone could hear him. "Wasn't talking to you." "No, you weren't," Colt agreed, "but I heard it anyway, and I'm here to tell you something important. You listening?" Despite himself, Eli nodded. Colt's expression grew serious, his eyes locked on Eli's with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "I care. Always." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Eli wanted to scoff, to throw them back in the stranger's face, to protect himself from the disappointment that would inevitably follow. But something in Colt's tone stopped him. The man wasn't trying to sound noble or righteous. He was just stating a fact, the way you'd say the sky was blue or water was wet. "You don't even know me," Eli whispered. "Don't need to know everything about a person to care that they're hurting," Colt replied. "I know you're hungry. I know you're alone. I know you're scared, even if you're trying not to show it. And I know what it feels like to think nobody gives a damn whether you live or die. So yeah, Eli Turner, I care." Eli felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure opening in the wall he'd built around his heart. His eyes burned, but he blinked hard, refusing to cry in front of this stranger. "Why?" The word came out hoarse and broken. Colt was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting past Eli to some distant point only he could see. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old memories. "Because once upon a time, I was a hungry boy on a street corner, and somebody stopped. Somebody cared. Made all the difference. Figure I owe it to pass that along." He stood up, his knees cracking slightly, and held out his hand to Eli. "Come on, let's get some food in you before you blow away in the next breeze." Eli stared at the offered hand like it might bite him. Every instinct screamed not to trust this. Nothing was free. Kindness always had a price, but his stomach twisted painfully, reminding him that his choices had narrowed to almost nothing. Slowly, hesitantly, Eli reached up and placed his small, dirty hand in Colt's large, calloused one. The cowboy's grip was firm but gentle as he pulled Eli to his feet. The boy swayed slightly, dizzy from standing too quickly on an empty stomach, and Colt steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. "Easy there," Colt said. "When's the last time you ate anything substantial?" "Define substantial," Eli muttered. Colt's jaw tightened. "That's what I thought. Come on." He kept his hand on Eli's shoulder, not gripping or restraining, just guiding, as they walked down the street together. Eli was intensely aware of the stares they were drawing. A cowboy and a ragamuffin orphan made for an odd pairing, and Sweetwater Creek was a town that noticed such things. They passed the saloon, where rough laughter and piano music spilled out into the evening. They passed the telegraph office, and the land office, and the lawyer's practice. Finally, they arrived at the Sweetwater Hotel, a two-story structure that was the closest thing the town had to luxury. Eli balked at the entrance. "I can't go in there. They'll just throw me out." "Not if you're with me," Colt said calmly, and pushed through the door. The lobby was modest but clean, with a faded carpet and a desk where a thin man with spectacles looked up from his ledger. His expression immediately soured when he saw Eli. "Mr. Dawson," the clerk said in a tone that managed to be both obsequious and disapproving. "I'm afraid we don't allow, that is to say, the hotel has standards. The hotel has a dining room, doesn't it?" Colt's voice was pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "Well, yes, but, and that dining room serves food to paying customers?" "Of course, however. Then we'll take a table for two, and before you say another word, let me be real clear." Colt leaned forward slightly, and though his voice never rose, something in his posture made the clerk shrink back. "This boy is my guest. He'll be treated with the same respect you'd show any other guest in this establishment. We understand each other?" The clerk swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Of course, Mr. Dawson. Right this way." Eli followed in a daze as they were led through a doorway into a small dining room. It was early yet, and only two other tables were occupied. A traveling salesman eating alone in one corner, and an elderly couple sharing a quiet meal by the window. The room smelled of fresh bread and roasted meat, and Eli's stomach cramped so hard he nearly doubled over. The clerk seated them at a corner table, brought 2 glasses of water, and scurried away as quickly as propriety allowed. Eli grabbed his glass and drank greedily, water dribbling down his chin. It was the best thing he'd tasted in days. When he set the glass down, he found Colt watching him with an expression that was hard to name. Not pity exactly, but something deeper. Understanding, maybe. Recognition. "Order whatever you want," Colt said when a serving girl appeared with menus. "And I mean that, Eli. Whatever sounds good." Eli stared at the menu, but the words swam before his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been in a restaurant, much less ordered from a menu. I don't... How about I order for both of us?" Colt suggested gently. When Eli nodded gratefully, Colt turned to the serving girl, a young woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron. "We'll have 2 bowls of your beef stew, 2 servings of cornbread, and..." He glanced at Eli. "You like apple pie?" Yeah," Eli whispered. 2 slices of apple pie for after, and keep the water coming." "Right away, sir," the girl said with a smile, and disappeared into the kitchen. Silence settled over the table. Eli fidgeted with his glass, acutely aware of how out of place he was. His filthy clothes, his dirty hands, his tangled hair, he looked like something dragged in by a stray dog. But Colt seemed unbothered, sitting back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man perfectly comfortable in his own skin. "So," Colt said eventually, "tell me about yourself, Eli Turner." "Ain't much to tell." "I doubt that's true. Everybody's got a story. Mine ain't very interesting." "Let me be the judge of that." Colt's tone was patient, not pushing, just inviting. Eli picked at a splinter on the table. "My folks died when I was little. Can't hardly remember them now. Got put in an orphanage run by Mrs. Halstead. She was all right, I guess. Better than some. But she died 3 days back, and they shut the place down, and nobody wanted me, so..." He shrugged, trying to make it sound like it didn't matter. "So here I am." "Here you are," Colt echoed quietly. "And before the orphanage? You remember anything from before?" Eli closed his eyes, reaching back into the fog of early memory. "My ma used to sing. Don't remember the words, just the feeling of it, you know? Safe, warm. And my pa..." He frowned, struggling for details that had faded like old photographs. "He taught me to whistle, or tried to. I never got the hang of it." "You were loved," Colt said. It wasn't a question. "I guess. Long time ago now." The food arrived then, steaming bowls of thick stew loaded with chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions. The cornbread was still warm from the oven, golden and glistening with butter. The smell alone was almost enough to make Eli cry. "Easy," Colt warned as Eli grabbed his spoon. "You'll make yourself sick if you eat too fast. Trust me on this. Small bites, slow down." It was torture, but Eli forced himself to take Colt's advice. Each spoonful was heaven, rich and savory, the beef so tender it fell apart in his mouth, the vegetables soft and flavorful. He'd forgotten that food could taste like this, could be anything other than fuel to stop the gnawing in your gut. They ate in companionable silence for a while. Colt matched Eli's pace, not wolfing down his own food but eating steadily, occasionally breaking off pieces of cornbread to soak up the gravy. Eli noticed the man's hands, scarred and calloused, with rope burns on the palms and a long white scar across the back of his right hand. Working hands, hard-living hands. "What about you?" Eli asked between bites, surprising himself. "You got a story?" Colt smiled faintly. "Course I do. Born in Missouri, raised rough. Lost my own folks to cholera when I was about your age. Bounced around after that, worked farms, ranches, whatever would have me. Learned to rope and ride, punch cattle, break horses. Been doing that ever since." "You got family now?" "Not to speak of. Got a spread up in the hill country, about 30 miles north of here. Just me and a few head of cattle, some horses. Quiet life, mostly." "Lonely," Eli said without thinking, then flushed. "Sorry, I didn't mean..." "No, you're right," Colt interrupted. "It is lonely. Never much minded before, but lately..." He shrugged. "Lately, it's been feeling emptier than usual. Maybe that's why I stopped tonight. Saw you and thought, here's someone who understands what lonely feels like." "I understand," Eli said quietly. "I understand real well." They finished their stew, and the serving girl brought the apple pie, huge slices with flaky crust and cinnamon-spiced filling. Eli ate his slowly, savoring every bite, making it last. By the time he scraped the last crumbs from his plate, he felt fuller than he had in months. Almost uncomfortably full, but in the best possible way. Colt paid the bill and left a generous tip for the serving girl, who beamed at him. As they stood to leave, Eli felt a wave of panic wash over him. It had been wonderful. But it was over now. Colt would go back to his hotel room or head out to his ranch, and Eli would go back to the streets, back to scrounging in hunger and sleeping in alleys. The magic would end, like it always did. They walked back through the lobby, where the clerk studiously avoided looking at them. Outside, the night had fully fallen, stars beginning to prick through the darkening sky. The street lamps were lit now, casting pools of yellow light along the boardwalk. Colt stopped outside the hotel and turned to Eli. "Where you been sleeping?" Eli shrugged, defensive again. "Around. Fine places." "Behind the livery? Alley by the bank?" "Maybe. Colt was quiet for a moment, then made a decision. I got a room here for the night. Got 2 beds. You can take the spare. Eli's eyes went wide. You mean... I mean, you're sleeping inside tonight, in a real bed. Tomorrow. Colt hesitated, and Eli saw him wrestling with something. Tomorrow? We'll figure out tomorrow. But tonight, you're safe and warm and fed. That sound all right to you? Eli couldn't speak. The crack in his chest widened further, and this time he couldn't stop the tears from coming. They spilled down his cheeks, hot and embarrassing, and he scrubbed at them with his dirty hands. Hey, Colt said gently, crouching down again to Eli's level. Hey, it's all right. You're all right. Nobody's ever... Eli's voice broke. Nobody's ever just been kind. Not expecting nothing back, not wanting nothing from me. I don't want nothing from you, Eli, Colt said seriously, except maybe for you to believe me when I tell you that you matter, that you're worth caring about. Can you do that? Eli nodded, still crying, and before he could think better of it, he lurched forward and wrapped his arms around Colt's neck. The cowboy stiffened for just a second, surprised, and then his arms came up and held Eli close, one hand on the back of the boy's head. I got you, Colt murmured. I got you, son. You're safe now. They stood like that for a long moment on the darkening street, a cowboy and a lost boy, 2 lonely souls finding unexpected comfort in each other. When Eli finally pulled back, he felt steadier somehow, like maybe, just maybe, the ground beneath his feet wasn't quite so treacherous. Colt led him back inside and up the stairs to the 2nd floor. His room was simple but clean. 2 beds with real mattresses, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a small mirror on the wall. To Eli, who'd been sleeping on dirt and stone, it looked like a palace. There's water in the pitcher, Colt said. Why don't you wash up a bit? I'll see if I can rustle up something cleaner for you to sleep in. He left Eli alone for a few minutes, and the boy approached the washstand cautiously, as if it might disappear if he moved too fast. He poured water into the basin and splashed his face, watching the dirt swirl away in the bowl. His reflection in the mirror startled him. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, a purple bruise on his jaw from where Morrison had grabbed him. He looked like a ghost. Colt returned with a shirt that would be comically large on Eli, one of his own, clearly, and a pair of long johns. Best I could do on short notice, they'll swallow you whole, but they're clean. Eli changed behind a privacy screen, emerging in the oversized clothes that hung on him like a tent. Colt's mouth twitched. Well, you look ridiculous, but at least you're clean. Thanks, Eli said, and was surprised to find he meant it. For everything. Don't mention it. Colt gestured to the bed nearest the window. That one's yours. I'm an early riser, so don't be surprised if you wake up, and I'm already moving around. But you sleep as long as you need, all right? Eli climbed into the bed, and the mattress felt like heaven beneath him. The sheets were clean and cool, and there was an actual pillow for his head. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept in a real bed. Maybe years. Colt settled into the other bed. His gun belt hung on the bedpost within easy reach, a cowboy's habit. He turned down the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, except for the moonlight streaming through the window. Colt? Eli's voice was small in the darkness. Yeah? Why'd you really do this? A long silence. Eli thought maybe Colt wouldn't answer, but then the cowboy's voice came low and thoughtful. Told you before. Somebody helped me once when I was young and desperate. Man named Jack Reardon. I was about 14, stealing food to survive, and he caught me red-handed. But instead of turning me in, he gave me a job on his ranch, taught me everything I know about cattle and horses, about being a decent man. He died 5 years back, but I think about him near every day. So you're paying it forward, Eli said. Something like that. Jack used to say that the measure of a man ain't in how much he takes, but in how much he gives when it costs him something. Well, this didn't cost me much, just a meal and half a room for the night. But maybe it means something to you. Maybe someday, when you're grown and got your feet under you, you'll remember this night. And maybe you'll stop for some kid who needs help. I will, Eli promised in the darkness. I swear I will. That's good enough for me. Now get some sleep, Eli Turner. Tomorrow's a new day. Eli closed his eyes, but sleep felt impossible despite his exhaustion. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning he'd been sure he was going to die, starve to death, or freeze, or just give up. And now he was in a warm bed with a full stomach, listening to the steady breathing of a man who'd shown him more kindness in a few hours than he'd known in years. It didn't seem real. It didn't seem possible. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in his mind like a prayer. I care, always. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Eli Turner went to sleep believing that maybe, just maybe, those words were true. Across town, in a small boarding house on the edge of Sweetwater Creek, Margaret Hale sat on the edge of a narrow bed and stared at the single carpet bag that contained everything she owned. Her hands trembled as she folded the last of her clothes, 3 dresses, all plain and serviceable, 2 petticoats, some undergarments, a nightgown. 28 years old, dismissed from her position, and nowhere to go. The story of her life, it seemed. She'd known this was coming. You didn't defy Mrs. Halstead, God rest her soul, and expect to keep your position. But Margaret had done it anyway, because what Mrs. Halstead had been doing to those children, especially to little Eli Turner, was wrong, cruel even, though the old woman would have called it necessary discipline. Margaret had protested too many times, had been too soft, too lenient, too unwilling to use the rod. And so she'd been dismissed 2 weeks before Mrs. Halstead's sudden death. She should have left town immediately, but she'd lingered, worried about the children, especially Eli. When the orphanage closed and the children scattered, Margaret had searched for Eli desperately. But the boy had vanished like smoke, and no one seemed to know or care where he'd gone. Now, 3 days later, she was out of money and out of options. Tomorrow morning, she'd have to leave Sweetwater Creek. Where she'd go, she had no idea. Maybe try to find work as a governess somewhere, though without references that would be nearly impossible. Maybe head east to the cities, where they needed teachers and didn't ask too many questions. A knock at the door interrupted her spiral of worry. Miss Hale? You decent? Yes, come in, Mrs. Mackenzie, the boarding house owner, pushed the door open. She was a stout woman in her 50s with a practical manner and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Thought you should know. I saw your boy, the Turner child. Margaret's heart leaped. Eli? Where? At the hotel, having supper with some cowboy. Looked like he'd found himself a guardian angel. The man was feeding him proper, treating him kind. Thought you'd want to know before you leave tomorrow. The hotel, Margaret repeated, already reaching for her shawl. Thank you, Mrs. Mackenzie. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet. That cowboy didn't look like the settling down type. Probably just being charitable for a night. But maybe you can talk some sense into him, convince him to help the boy more permanent-like. Margaret hurried out into the night, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The streets were quiet now, most of the town already settled in for the evening. She made her way to the Sweetwater Hotel, her boots clicking on the boardwalk. The clerk was locking up the front door when she arrived. I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're closed for the evening. Guests only. Please, Margaret said urgently. I'm looking for a boy. About 10 years old, blonde hair, very thin. I was told he came here earlier with a cowboy. The clerk's expression softened slightly. Oh, the Turner boy. Yes, Mr. Dawson brought him in. They had supper and went up to Mr. Dawson's room, room 12, second floor. But, ma'am, I can't just let you— I used to be his teacher, Margaret interrupted, at the orphanage. I've been looking for him for 3 days. Please, I just need to make sure he's all right. The clerk hesitated, then sighed and unlocked the door. 5 minutes, and if Mr. Dawson complains, I never saw you. Thank you, Margaret breathed and hurried inside and up the stairs. She found room 12 and paused outside, suddenly uncertain. What was she going to say? What right did she have to interfere? She'd been dismissed from the orphanage. She had no legal authority over Eli, no claim on him at all. But she'd promised herself she'd look after him. Even after being fired, she'd checked on him whenever she could, slipped him food when Mrs. Halstead wasn't looking. The boy had been treated harshly, punished for the smallest infractions, and Margaret's heart had broken for him. She knocked softly on the door. Movement inside, then footsteps. The door opened to reveal a tall man in his shirt sleeves, his hat off, to reveal dark hair touched with gray at the temples. His eyes, a striking gray blue, regarded her with cautious curiosity. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I'm Margaret Hale," she said quickly. "I was a teacher at the orphanage where Eli Turner stayed. I've been searching for him since the orphanage closed. I was told he's here with you. Is he all right?" Colt's expression shifted, understanding dawning. "He's fine. Asleep, actually. Been a hard few days for him. May I see him, please? I just need to know he's safe." Colt studied her for a moment, then nodded and stepped back, opening the door wider. Margaret slipped inside and immediately spotted Eli in the bed by the window, curled up under the blankets, his thin face peaceful in sleep. Relief flooded through her so powerfully she nearly wept. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for helping him." "Seemed like the right thing to do," Colt said quietly, pulling the door mostly closed so their voices wouldn't wake the boy. "You were his teacher?" "I tried to be. Mrs. Halstead, the woman who ran the orphanage, she was harsh with the children, particularly with Eli. He was spirited, you see, always questioning things, never quite obedient enough. I tried to protect him, but..." She trailed off, shame coloring her cheeks. "I was dismissed for being too soft." "So you cared about him," Colt said. "It wasn't a question. I still do. I've been frantic trying to find him. When the orphanage closed and all the children were sent away, Eli just disappeared. No one seemed to know or care where he'd gone." "He's been on the streets," Colt said grimly. "Starving. I found him outside Morrison's store, looking like he'd given up on living, said nobody cared." Margaret closed her eyes, pain lancing through her. "That's my fault. I should have found him sooner. I should have—" "You're here now," Colt interrupted gently. "That counts for something." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two strangers connected by concern for a sleeping child. Margaret studied the cowboy covertly, his weathered face, his careful posture, the gun belt hung within easy reach. A dangerous man, perhaps, but something in his eyes spoke of kindness. "What will happen to him?" she asked quietly. "Tomorrow, I mean. Where will he go?" Colt's jaw worked. "I've been thinking on that. Can't just leave him here, can I? But I don't know what else to do. I got a ranch, but it's just me. I don't know nothing about raising children." "Neither do I, really," Margaret admitted. "I taught them, but I never had charge of one on my own. And now I'm leaving town tomorrow. I've run out of money, lost my position. I don't even know where I'm going." They looked at each other, and Margaret saw her own helplessness reflected in the cowboy's eyes. Two adults who wanted to help a child but didn't know how. "Seems wrong," Colt said finally. "Seems wrong that a boy like that should fall through the cracks just because nobody knows quite what to do with him." "It is wrong," Margaret agreed fiercely. "He deserves better. He deserves a home, a family, someone who cares about him." "He does," Colt said slowly, an idea clearly forming in his mind. Then he shook his head. "No, that's crazy. You'd never agree to it." "Agree to what?" "Nothing. Forget I said anything." But Margaret had seen the spark of possibility in his eyes, and she wasn't about to let it go. "Tell me, please. At this point, I'm willing to consider anything." Colt ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking uncertain, a stark contrast to the confident man who'd answered the door. "I got a ranch. It's not much, but it's mine. Got a decent cabin, some land, enough cattle to make a living. It's quiet, peaceful. Good place for a boy to grow up." "That sounds wonderful for him," Margaret said cautiously. "But I can't raise a boy on my own," Colt continued. "Don't know the first thing about schooling or proper care or any of it. And you're a teacher. You know how to care for children, but you got nowhere to go and no way to support yourself or him." Margaret's heart began to pound as she understood where this was leading. "You're suggesting, I'm suggesting that maybe we could help each other, you and me. We could both take care of Eli. You could teach him, make sure he gets proper raising. I could provide a home, food, security. Between the two of us, maybe we could give him what he needs." "You want me to come to your ranch," Margaret said slowly, "to help you raise Eli?" "I know it sounds crazy." "It does," she interrupted. "It sounds completely insane. I don't know you. You don't know me. We'd be living under the same roof, two unmarried people, and the scandal. There's nobody for miles around to scandalize," Colt pointed out. And if it bothers you that much, we could, I don't know, build you a separate cabin or something. Point is, the boy needs both of us. He needs someone to provide for him, and someone to teach him, and someone to just care. We could do that together. Margaret wanted to refuse. Every ounce of her proper upbringing screamed at her to decline this ridiculous proposition. But as she looked at Eli sleeping peacefully in the bed, she felt something shift inside her. Here was a chance, maybe the only chance, to save this boy, to give him the life he deserved. And if it cost her reputation, well, what did reputation matter if a child's life hung in the balance? I need to think about this, she said finally. Fair enough. I'm leaving tomorrow afternoon, heading back to the ranch. If you decide you want to come along, you and Eli both, meet me at the livery stable at noon. If you don't show up, I'll understand. No hard feelings. And what will you do with Eli if I don't come? Colt's expression grew grim. I'll take him with me anyway. Can't leave him here to starve. Figure I'll muddle through somehow, even if I don't know what I'm doing. Despite everything, Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. You're a good man, Mr. Dawson. Colt. Just Colt. And I don't know about good, just trying to do what's right. That's the definition of good, isn't it? Margaret moved toward the door, then paused. May I ask you something? Sure. Why did you stop tonight? What made you notice Eli when so many others walked right past? Colt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Because I used to be him. Because I know what it feels like to be hungry and alone and convinced that nobody in the whole world gives a damn whether you live or die. And because somebody stopped for me once, and it saved my life. Figure the least I can do is pass that along. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Then I'll see you at the livery stable tomorrow, noon. You're coming? Colt's eyebrows rose in surprise. I'm coming. We both are. Eli deserves this chance, and I'd never forgive myself if I let fear or propriety stand in the way of giving it to him. All right then. A slow smile spread across Colt's face, transforming his weathered features. Noon tomorrow. Bring whatever you can carry. It's about 30 miles to the ranch, so we'll need to travel light. Margaret nodded and slipped out of the room, her heart racing. Had she really just agreed to this? To run off to some remote ranch with a cowboy she'd just met? All to care for a child who wasn't even legally in her custody? Yes. Yes, she had. And as she walked back through the quiet streets to the boarding house, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Tomorrow would bring a new beginning. For Eli. For her. And perhaps, though she barely dared to think it, for the quiet cowboy who'd shown them both that kindness still existed in this harsh world. In the hotel room, Colt stood at the window, watching Margaret's retreating figure disappear into the darkness. He'd made an impulsive offer tonight, actually several impulsive offers. Taking in a stray boy, inviting a stranger to his home, upending his quiet, solitary life. But as he looked at Eli sleeping peacefully, something in his chest eased. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long felt, for the first time in years, like it might finally be lifting. Well, Jack, Colt murmured to the memory of his old mentor, looks like I'm about to find out if I learned anything from you about being a decent man. Hope I don't mess this up too bad. Outside, the Texas night stretched vast and starry overhead, full of possibility and promise. And in that moment, on the cusp of everything changing, 3 lost souls found the beginnings of something none of them had expected. A family. The morning sun came early, slicing through the hotel window and painting golden stripes across the worn floorboards. Eli woke slowly, confused by the softness beneath him, the clean smell of laundered sheets, the unfamiliar quiet. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't remember where he was, and panic fluttered in his chest like a trapped bird. Then he heard the steady breathing from the other bed and remembered. Colt. The cowboy who'd stopped. The meal. The promise that someone cared. Eli sat up carefully, his body aching in strange places. Not the sharp pain of hunger or cold, but the deep soreness that came from muscles finally allowed to relax after being tensed for too long. In the other bed, Colt was already awake, propped up on one elbow, watching him with those calm gray-blue eyes. Morning, the cowboy said quietly. How'd you sleep? Like I was dead, Eli admitted, his voice still rough with sleep. Didn't wake up once. Usually I wake up a dozen times, making sure nobody's sneaking up on me or trying to chase me off. Nobody's chasing you anywhere, Colt said firmly. He swung his legs out of bed, the frame creaking under his weight. You hungry? Eli's stomach answered before he could, growling loudly enough to make them both smile. I could eat. Good. Let's get you fed, and then we need to have ourselves a conversation about what happens next. They washed up and dressed, Eli reluctantly putting his ragged clothes back on since he had nothing else, and headed downstairs to the hotel dining room. The same serving girl from the night before greeted them with a warm smile and brought coffee for Colt and milk for Eli, followed by plates piled high with eggs, bacon, biscuits, and gravy. Eli ate more slowly this time, heeding Colt's advice from the night before, savoring each bite. The food was simple but good, and the dining room was quiet in the early morning hour. Just a few other guests scattered at various tables, lost in their own thoughts and newspapers. Eli, Colt said when they'd both made decent progress on their plates, I want to talk to you about something important. You listening? The boy nodded, setting down his fork with a wariness that suggested he'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop. Nothing good lasted. Every child who'd been through what Eli had learned that lesson hard. Last night, after you fell asleep, your teacher came by. Miss Hale. Eli's eyes widened. Miss Margaret? She was here? She was. Been looking for you since the orphanage closed, worried sick. She wanted to make sure you were all right. A complicated mix of emotions crossed Eli's face. Relief, shame, fear. I didn't mean to worry her. I couldn't stay there, not after Mrs. Halstead died. They were going to send me away somewhere worse, I knew it. I understand, but here's the thing. Miss Hale and we got to talking about your situation, about what you need. And we came up with an idea, but it only works if you're willing to trust us both. Eli's jaw set stubbornly. What kind of idea? Colt leaned back in his chair, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. I told you last night about my ranch. It's not much, but it's mine, and it's a good place. Clean air, open land, honest work. I'm thinking maybe you could come live there with me, help out with the cattle and horses, learn the trade. I'd teach you everything I know. Hope sparked in Eli's chest, bright and painful. You mean it? You'd take me in? For real? I mean it. But here's the thing. I'm just a cowboy, Eli. I can teach you about ranching and survival and how to sit a horse, but I can't teach you much else. You need schooling, proper raising, someone who knows about books and manners and all the things that'll help you make your way in the world. Miss Margaret, Eli said, understanding dawning. That's right. I've asked her to come along too, to live at the ranch and be your teacher. Between the two of us, we figure we can give you a real chance at a good life. But it's your choice, Eli. If you don't want this, if you'd rather stay in town or try to find something else, that's your right. I won't force you into anything. Eli stared at him, his throat tight with emotion. A home. A real home. With people who wanted him there. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. Things like this didn't happen to boys like him. Why? The question came out hoarse. Why would you do all this for me? I ain't nothing to you. Colt's expression grew serious and he leaned forward, his elbows on the table. You remember what I told you last night about how somebody helped me once when I was desperate? Eli nodded. That man, Jack Reardon, he didn't just give me a job, he gave me a purpose. Taught me that my life could mean something, that I wasn't just trash to be swept aside. And before he died, you know what he said to me? Eli shook his head, unable to speak. He said, Colt, the best thing you can do with what I've given you is pass it along. Find somebody who needs what you needed and give it to them freely. That's how goodness survives in this hard world, one person at a time, one act of kindness building on another. So that's what I'm doing, Eli. I'm passing along what Jack gave me, and someday, when you're grown and strong, maybe you'll do the same for somebody else. Tears burned in Eli's eyes, and he didn't bother trying to hide them this time. I don't know how to be part of a family. I barely remember what that's like. Neither do I, Colt admitted with a slight smile. So I guess we'll figure it out together. What do you say? Eli wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, sniffling. Miss Margaret really said yes? She really wants to come? She really does. We're meeting her at the livery stable at noon. If you want to come with us, you'll have a home, Eli. A real home. I give you my word on that. And you won't send me away? Even if I mess up or cause trouble? Everyone messes up and causes trouble sometimes. That's part of being human. But no, I won't send you away. Once you're mine for keeps. That's a promise. Eli looked down at his plate, at the remains of a breakfast that would have seemed like a feast just yesterday, and made his decision. Okay, I'll come with you, both of you. Colt's face broke into a genuine smile, transforming his weathered features. That's good, son. That's real good. Now finish your breakfast. We've got supplies to gather before we head out. They spent the rest of the morning preparing for the journey. Colt bought Eli a set of proper clothes from the general store. Morrison glared but didn't dare refuse the transaction, including sturdy pants, a shirt, a jacket, boots that actually fit, and a hat to keep the sun off. Eli kept touching the new clothes in wonder, unable to believe they were really his. Can't have you showing up at the ranch in rags, Colt said gruffly, paying Morrison without looking at him. Besides, you'll be working. Need proper gear for that. They also bought supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, dried beans, bacon, and other staples that would stock the ranch's pantry. Colt added a few books to the pile, basic readers and a Bible, for Margaret to use in teaching Eli. As they loaded everything onto Colt's horse at the livery stable, Eli kept glancing nervously toward the street, watching for Miss Margaret. What if she didn't come? What if she'd changed her mind overnight, realized how crazy this whole plan was? But as the church bells chimed noon, a figure appeared at the end of the street, walking purposefully toward them. Margaret Hale wore a simple traveling dress in dark blue, her hair pinned up neatly beneath a modest bonnet. She carried a single carpet bag and moved with quiet determination, her spine straight despite the uncertainty that must have been eating at her. "Miss Margaret!" Eli broke away from Colt and ran to her, unable to contain himself. She set down her bag and caught him as he crashed into her, wrapping her arms around him tightly. "Oh, Eli, I've been so worried about you. Are you all right? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he mumbled into her shoulder. "Better than fine. Did Mr. Colt tell you about the ranch?" "He did." She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. "And I've decided to come along, if you'll have me. I know I wasn't always able to protect you at the orphanage, but I'd like another chance. If you're willing." "I'm willing," Eli said fervently. "I'm real willing." Margaret smiled, and something in her expression eased. She looked up as Colt approached, leading his horse and a mule loaded with supplies. "Miss Hale," he greeted her with a respectful nod. "Glad you came. I wasn't entirely sure you would." "I almost didn't," she admitted honestly. "I spent half the night talking myself out of it, but then I remembered why I became a teacher in the first place, to help children who needed help. And Eli needs this. Needs us. So here I am." "Here you are," Colt agreed. He gestured to the mule. "I've packed your bag with the supplies. It's about a 6-hour ride to the ranch if we keep a steady pace. I've got my horse, and I picked up a gentle mare for you and Eli to share. She's old but steady, won't give you any trouble." Margaret eyed the horses nervously. "I should mention that I've never actually ridden before." Colt's eyebrows rose. "Never?" "I grew up in Boston. We had carriages, not horses." "Well, today you're going to learn. Don't worry. Like I said, Bessie here is about as gentle as they come." "Eli, you ever ridden?" "Once or twice," Eli said. "Mrs. Halstead's brother had a farm. He let me sit on his old plow horse sometimes." "That'll do. Come on, I'll help you both get mounted." Getting Margaret onto the horse proved to be an adventure. She approached Bessie with the caution of someone approaching a sleeping bear, and when Colt tried to help her into the saddle, she froze. "It's very high up," she said faintly. "That's kind of the point of a horse," Colt said, trying not to smile. "Here, put your foot in the stirrup. That's right. Now grab the saddle horn. I'm going to boost you up on 3. 1, 2. Margaret squeaked as Colt lifted her into the saddle, clutching the horn with white knuckles. Bessie, bless her, didn't so much as twitch. "There you go," Colt said encouragingly. "You're a natural." "I'm terrified," Margaret corrected, but she managed a shaky smile. Eli climbed up behind her with more confidence, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Don't worry, Miss Margaret. I won't let you fall." "My hero," she said, and Eli could hear the affection in her voice despite her nerves. Colt swung into his own saddle with easy grace, settling into the leather like he'd been born there. He took the mule's lead rope in one hand and his reins in the other. "All right then, let's head home. Miss Hale, just hold the reins loose and let Bessie follow my horse. She knows the way. If you need to stop or slow down, just say so." They rode out of Sweetwater Creek at a walk, drawing curious stares from the townspeople. Eli kept his chin up, trying not to look back at the only place he'd ever really known. He was leaving behind hunger and loneliness and sleeping in alleys, heading toward something new and unknown. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. The town gave way to open country, the buildings growing sparse and then disappearing entirely. The land rolled out before them in waves of golden grass, dotted with mesquite and live oak trees. The sky stretched overhead, impossibly blue and vast, with clouds drifting like white ships on an azure sea. Margaret gradually relaxed in the saddle as she realized Bessie truly was content to follow Colt's horse without much guidance. Eli kept up a running commentary, pointing out birds and rabbits and anything else that caught his attention, his excitement bubbling over. "You ever seen an armadillo, Miss Margaret? Mr. Colt says they've got them on the ranch, and deer too, and wild turkeys, and sometimes even bears, though he says they mostly stay up in the hills." Colt listened to the boy's chatter with a slight smile, occasionally adding details or corrections. Margaret found herself watching the cowboy as they rode, trying to reconcile her initial impressions with the reality of what he'd done. He'd taken in a starving child without hesitation, offered her a place when she had nowhere else to go, and was now leading them both toward an uncertain future with quiet confidence. He was an unusual man, hard to read, with that weathered face and those careful eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. But there was a fundamental decency to him that Margaret recognized, a bedrock of integrity that made her feel, despite all logic and propriety, that she'd made the right choice in coming. The sun climbed higher as they rode, and the temperature rose with it. Texas in late spring could be brutal, and Margaret was grateful for the bonnet shading her face. Eli had fallen quiet, his initial excitement giving way to the exhaustion of a body still recovering from days of deprivation. "We'll stop soon," Colt called back, noticing the boy's drooping posture. "There's a creek about another mile ahead. We can rest there, let the horses drink, have some lunch." True to his word, they soon came upon a line of cottonwood trees marking the path of a small creek. The water ran clear over smooth stones, and the shade was blissfully cool after the open sun. Colt helped Margaret and Eli dismount, then set about tending to the horses while Margaret spread a blanket under the trees. Eli immediately kicked off his new boots and waded into the creek, splashing and laughing. Margaret watched him with a bittersweet smile. I haven't seen him like this in so long. Happy, carefree. He was always so tense at the orphanage, always braced for punishment. Colt came to stand beside her, his arms crossed over his chest. "Mrs. Halstead was hard on him?" She was hard on all the children, but especially Eli. He was too spirited for her liking, too quick with questions, too slow to obey without understanding why. She believed in breaking a child's will to make them tractable. Margaret's voice hardened. "I disagreed, strongly. That's why I was dismissed." "Then I'm glad you were dismissed," Colt said bluntly. "World doesn't need more broken people, needs folks with spirit who can think for themselves." Margaret glanced at him in surprise. "That's a progressive view for a cowboy." He shrugged. "Jack Reardon taught me that. Said the best workers aren't the ones who obey without thinking, but the ones who understand what needs doing and why. Same goes for raising kids, I figure." "You figured right." Margaret hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at her all morning. "Mr. Dawson, Colt. Colt, then, what exactly are we doing here? I mean, what are the arrangements? I know we discussed this last night, but in the light of day, I realize we never really sorted out the practical details." Colt was quiet for a moment, watching Eli play in the creek. "The cabin's got 2 rooms, a main room with the kitchen and fireplace, and a bedroom. I was thinking you could take the bedroom, and Eli and I could sleep in the main room. There's a loft space up top that would work well enough for the boy. As for the rest," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I figure we'll work it out as we go. You'll teach Eli, help with the cooking and such. I'll handle the ranch work and provide for us. We'll both look after the boy. Beyond that, we'll just have to trust each other to be decent about things. And what will people think when they find out about this arrangement? Nearest neighbor's 5 miles away, and the town's a good ride. Ain't many people around to think anything, but if it bothers you, we can make other arrangements. Like I said last night, I could build you a separate cabin. Margaret shook her head slowly. No, that would be wasteful and impractical. And honestly, I've spent too much of my life worrying about what people think. It's part of why I stayed in that orphanage as long as I did, even when I knew what Mrs. Halstead was doing was wrong. I was more concerned with keeping my position, my reputation, than with truly helping those children. I won't make that mistake again. That takes courage, Colt observed. Or desperation, Margaret said with a wry smile. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. They ate a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apples, sitting in the dappled shade while the horses grazed nearby. Eli ate ravenously, as if still not quite believing there would be more food later. Margaret made a mental note to help him understand that hunger was behind him now, that he could trust in regular meals. When they set out again, the afternoon stretched long and warm before them. The landscape gradually changed as they rode, the flat grassland giving way to rolling hills. Trees became more frequent, oak and cedar and elm, and the air took on a different quality, sweeter and cleaner. We're getting close, Colt announced as they crested a hill. See that valley there? That's my land. Ours now, I guess. Margaret looked where he was pointing and caught her breath. The valley spread below them like something from a painting, lush and green, cradled between gentle hills. A creek sparkled in the sunlight, winding through the center like a silver ribbon. And there, nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, was a cabin. It's beautiful, she whispered. It'll do, Colt said, but she could hear the pride in his voice. Come on, let's get you home. They descended into the valley as the afternoon began its slow slide toward evening. Cattle dotted the hillsides, not a huge herd, but healthy-looking animals that raised their heads to watch the newcomers pass. A few horses grazed in a fenced pasture near the cabin, including a striking paint mare that whinnied at their approach. The cabin itself was modest but well-built, constructed of thick logs chinked with clay. It had a covered porch across the front, a stone chimney on one end, and windows with real glass that caught the late sunlight. Behind it stood a barn, a chicken coop, and a few other outbuildings. It's not fancy, Colt said as he helped Margaret dismount, but it's solid. Built it myself over the course of 2 summers. Roof doesn't leak, walls keep the wind out, and the fireplace draws clean. Eli had already jumped down and was running around the yard, exploring everything with wide eyes. Mr. Colt, you got chickens, and is that a dog? A yellow hound had emerged from beneath the porch, tail wagging cautiously. Colt whistled and the dog came bounding over, tongue lolling. That's Buck. He's friendly, just a little shy with strangers. Buck, this here is Eli and Miss Margaret. They're family now, understand? The dog sniffed Eli thoroughly, then apparently decided the boy was acceptable and began licking his face enthusiastically. Eli laughed, the sound bright and free, and something in Margaret's chest tightened. This was right. Whatever the circumstances, whatever the impropriety, this was where they were meant to be. Colt led them inside, and Margaret looked around with a teacher's evaluating eye. The main room was larger than she'd expected, with a sturdy table and chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, and shelves lined with books and supplies. A ladder led up to a loft space where Eli would sleep. Everything was clean but sparse, the home of a man who lived simply and didn't see the need for decoration. The bedroom's through there, Colt said, pointing to a door on the far wall. It's got a bed, a wardrobe, a washstand. Nothing fancy, but it's yours now. I'll sleep out here. Margaret peeked into the bedroom and found it exactly as he'd described, functional and plain, but clean and private. A real bed with a real mattress, a window overlooking the valley, hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. After sharing a boarding house room with 3 other women, it seemed like a palace. It's perfect, she said honestly. Thank you, Colt. He nodded, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. I'll get your things brought in and tend to the horses. Why don't you and Eli get settled? There's a spring house out back with milk and butter. We can have a simple supper tonight. I've got bacon and beans, and I think there's some cornmeal for Johnny cakes. I can cook, Margaret offered, if you'll show me where everything is. That'd be appreciated. Haven't had a proper cooked meal in I don't know how long. Over the next hour, they fell into an awkward but functional rhythm. Colt brought in the supplies in Margaret's bag, then disappeared to care for the horses. Margaret explored the kitchen area, finding it surprisingly well equipped: cast iron pots and pans, basic utensils, plates and cups. Eli helped her locate ingredients, chattering constantly about everything he'd seen. "There's a whole loft up there, Miss Margaret, with a real mattress and everything. And Mr. Colt says I can learn to ride the horses and help with the cattle. And he's got a dog. Did you see the dog? His name is Buck, and he's real friendly. And Mr. Colt says—" "Breathe, Eli," Margaret said with a laugh, ruffling his hair. "I'm glad you're excited, but you're going to wear yourself out before supper." By the time Colt returned, washing up at the pump outside, Margaret had bacon frying in a pan and beans warming in a pot. The cornmeal batter was mixed and ready to cook on the griddle. It wasn't fancy, but it smelled like home, and she saw Colt's expression soften as he stepped inside. "Been a long time since this place smelled like cooking," he said quietly. They ate together at the table as darkness fell outside, the meal simple but satisfying. Eli ate until he was full, truly full, not just less hungry, and then dozed off in his chair, exhausted by the day's journey and excitement. Colt lifted the boy easily and carried him to the loft, settling him onto the mattress and pulling a blanket over him. Margaret watched from below, touched by the gentleness in the cowboy's movements, the care he took not to wake the sleeping child. When Colt climbed back down, she had water heating for washing up. They worked in companionable silence, cleaning the dishes and putting away the remaining food. Outside, the night sounds of the Texas hill country drifted through the open windows. Crickets and frogs, the distant call of an owl, the soft lowing of cattle settling down for the night. "It's quiet here," Margaret observed. "That bother you?" "No, actually, it's peaceful. I'd forgotten what that felt like." Colt nodded, understanding. "That's why I came out here. After Jack died, the noise and crowds of town felt suffocating, needed space to breathe, to think, found this valley and knew it was right." Margaret dried the last plate and set it on the shelf. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer." "Why were you in Sweetwater Creek yesterday? You said you just finished a cattle drive." "That's right. We'd driven a herd up to the railhead in Fort Worth, got paid out. I was on my way home when I stopped in Sweetwater for supplies. Saw Eli and—" He shrugged. "You know the rest. You changed the entire course of 3 lives on an impulse." "Wasn't an impulse. Or if it was an impulse that felt right in my gut. Jack used to say that when something feels right, truly right, not just easy or convenient, you should follow that feeling. Said it was God or instinct or whatever you wanted to call it, but it was worth listening to." Margaret leaned against the table, studying him in the lamplight. "You loved him very much, Jack Reardon. He saved my life, gave me a purpose when I was convinced I didn't have one, taught me that being a man wasn't about being hard or tough, but about being decent, about caring for things, land, animals, people, about building something that lasts." Colt's voice roughened slightly. 5 years he's been gone, and I still hear his voice in my head sometimes, asking if I'm being the man he raised me to be. "I think he'd be proud of you," Margaret said softly. "I think what you did yesterday, what you're doing now, he'd be very proud." Colt looked away, uncomfortable with the emotion in her words. "Yeah, well, we'll see how it goes. This is all new territory for me. For all of us." Margaret moved toward the bedroom door, suddenly aware of how tired she was. "I should let you get some rest. It's been a very long day." "Margaret," Colt said, and she turned back, surprised by his use of her first name. "I just want you to know. I'm glad you came, for Eli's sake, but also, it'll be good to have someone else here, someone to talk to." She smiled. "I'm glad I came too. Good night, Colt." "Good night." Margaret closed the bedroom door and leaned against it, her heart beating faster than it should. This arrangement was unconventional, possibly scandalous, definitely complicated. But as she changed into her nightgown and climbed into the bed, a real bed with a real mattress and clean sheets, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Outside, in the main room, Colt banked the fire and spread his bedroll on the floor near the hearth. It wasn't as comfortable as the bed he'd given up, but he'd slept in worse places. Above him, in the loft, he could hear Eli's soft breathing, the boy deep in the sleep of the truly exhausted. Buck padded over and curled up beside him, and Colt scratched the dog's ears absently, staring up at the dark ceiling beams. He'd done it. He'd actually brought them here, taken on the responsibility of a child, and invited a strange woman into his home. It was reckless and impulsive and completely unlike his usual careful nature, but it also felt more right than anything he'd done in the 5 years since Jack's death. "Well, old friend," he whispered into the darkness, "here's hoping I don't mess this up too badly. They're counting on me now. All of us counting on each other, I guess. Wish you were here to tell me what to do next." But Jack wasn't there, and Colt would have to figure it out on his own. He closed his eyes, listening to the night sounds and the breathing of his unexpected family, and for the first time in a very long time, felt something other than loneliness settling into his bones. It might have been hope. It might have been fear. Probably it was both, tangled up together until he couldn't tell one from the other. But whatever it was better than the hollow emptiness that had filled this cabin before. Better than eating alone, sleeping alone, working alone day after day with no one to care whether he came home at night or disappeared into the wilderness forever. Tomorrow, they would begin figuring out how to be a family, how to live together, work together, build something lasting from this fragile beginning. Tonight, though, they could simply rest in the knowledge that none of them were alone anymore. In the bedroom, Margaret lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin settling, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods outside her window. She thought about the risks she'd taken today, the bridges she'd burned by leaving Sweetwater Creek without a backward glance. But she also thought about Eli's laughter as he played in the creek, the wonder in his eyes when he saw the valley, the peace on his face as he fell asleep knowing he was safe and wanted. For that alone, every risk was worth it. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, dreaming of golden grass and clear water, of a boy learning to ride and a quiet cowboy who'd stopped when no one else would. Dreaming of second chances and new beginnings, of hope taking root in the most unlikely of places. Outside, the Texas stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, indifferent to the small dramas of human hearts below. But in that modest cabin cradled in the valley, 3 souls who had been lost were beginning to find their way home. The journey was just beginning, and the road ahead was uncertain. But they would walk it together, bound by choice and compassion, and the simple, profound truth that sometimes, when life gives you a second chance, the bravest thing you can do is reach out and take it with both hands. Dawn broke soft and golden over the valley, spilling through the cabin windows like honey. Margaret woke to unfamiliar sounds. The crow of a rooster, the lowing of cattle, and beneath it all, the low murmur of male voices outside. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was, and then it all came rushing back. The ranch, Colt, Eli, the decision that had changed everything. She dressed quickly in her simplest work dress and pinned up her hair, studying her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow, less pinched perhaps, or maybe just less afraid. She'd spent so many years trying to fit into a mold that didn't quite suit her, being the proper teacher, the obedient employee, the woman who never caused trouble. But yesterday she'd walked away from all of that, and the sky hadn't fallen. When she emerged from the bedroom, the main room was empty, the fire already crackling in the hearth, and fresh coffee sitting warm on the stove. Through the window, she could see Colt and Eli down by the barn, the cowboy's hands moving as he explained something to the boy, who watched with rapt attention. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the window, watching them. Colt was showing Eli how to properly approach a horse, how to speak softly, move slowly, let the animal catch your scent before reaching out to touch. Eli mimicked his movements with careful concentration, and when he successfully stroked the nose of a gentle bay mare, his whoop of triumph carried all the way back to the cabin. She found herself smiling. This was good for him. Already, just one night away from the streets and hunger, Eli looked different, still too thin, still bearing the marks of hardship, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Margaret set about making breakfast, finding flour and eggs and a precious jar of preserves in the pantry. By the time Colt and Eli came tramping back to the cabin, their boots dusty and their faces wind-touched, She had flapjacks cooking on the griddle and bacon sizzling in the pan. "Something smells amazing," Eli declared, bursting through the door with Buck at his heels. "Miss Margaret, you should see the horses. Mr. Colt says I can learn to ride the paint mare. Her name is Daisy, and he's going to teach me how to saddle her and everything." "That's wonderful, Eli. But first, wash your hands, both of you." Colt raised an eyebrow, amused by the teacher's tone, but obediently moved to the wash basin. "Yes, ma'am." They ate together at the table, and Margaret was pleased to see Eli eating with better manners than he'd shown in Sweetwater Creek. The boy was learning already, watching Colt and mimicking his movements, trying to fit into this new life. "So," Colt said, pouring himself a second cup of coffee, "we should probably talk about how we're going to organize things around here. Divvy up the work, set some routines." Margaret nodded. "I was thinking about that. Eli needs schooling, reading, writing, arithmetic, history. I'd like to work with him every morning, 3 hours at least. That leaves the afternoons for other lessons." "Ranch work," Colt agreed. "Boy needs to learn how to handle himself out here, how to ride properly, rope, tend cattle, mend fences, all of it. That all right with you, Eli?" "Yes, sir." Eli's eyes shone with excitement. "Can we start today?" "Don't see why not. But first, let's hear what Miss Margaret has in mind for this morning." Margaret stood and retrieved one of the books Colt had bought in Sweetwater Creek. "I thought we'd start with reading. Eli, can you read at all?" The boy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "Some. Mrs. Halstead taught us our letters, but she didn't much care if we could actually read words. Said orphans didn't need book learning, just enough to read the Bible and sign our names." Margaret's jaw tightened at yet another reminder of the woman's cruelty, but she kept her voice gentle. "Well, we're going to change that. Reading opens up the whole world, Eli. Every book is an adventure, a chance to learn something new or visit places you've never been. Would you like that?" "I guess so," Eli said uncertainly. "Trust her," Colt said quietly. "Education's important. Might not seem like it matters much when you're feeding cattle or mending tack, but it does. Man who can read and write and figure has options a man without those skills don't have." After breakfast, Colt excused himself to work on the fences in the north pasture, and Margaret set up a makeshift schoolroom at the kitchen table. She started with assessment, gently probing what Eli already knew. The results were both better and worse than she'd expected. He could identify his letters and sound out simple words, but his comprehension was poor and his handwriting nearly illegible. They worked through the morning, Margaret patient and encouraging as Eli struggled with words that seemed to dance on the page. She discovered that he learned best when she connected the lessons to things he cared about. When she used examples about horses and cattle and the ranch, his attention sharpened and the words came easier. "See," she said, pointing to a passage in the reader. "This word here is pasture. You know what a pasture is, right?" "Where the horses graze," Eli said. "Exactly. And this word, fence. Like the fence Mr. Colt is mending right now. Reading isn't about memorizing meaningless words, Eli. It's about understanding the world around you." By the time noon rolled around, Eli was exhausted but proud. He'd successfully read an entire page with minimal help, and Margaret praised him sincerely. "That was excellent work. Tomorrow we'll do more. But for now, I think you've earned some time with Mr. Colt." Eli shot out of his chair like he'd been launched from a cannon, racing outside to find Colt. Margaret followed more slowly, carrying a basket she'd packed with bread, cheese, and apples. She found them down by the corral, Colt already explaining the parts of a saddle to an eager Eli. "Brought you both some lunch," she called. Colt looked up, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "I know, but I thought you might be hungry." They ate sitting on the fence rails, watching the horses graze in the pasture. The paint mare, Daisy, kept wandering close, clearly hoping for treats. Eli fed her an apple core, laughing when her lips tickled his palm. "She likes you," Colt observed. "That's good. A horse that likes you will try harder for you, be more forgiving of mistakes. First rule of working with animals: treat them with respect and kindness, and they'll give you the same back." "Does that work with people too?" Eli asked. Colt's eyes cut to Margaret briefly, then back to the boy. "Usually, not always, but usually. Most folks respond better to kindness than to meanness. Meanness just breeds more meanness, creates a cycle that's hard to break. But kindness, that can start a different kind of cycle, a better one. Margaret felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. This rough cowboy, who probably thought he wasn't good with words or feelings, had just articulated something profound. She wondered if he even realized it. After lunch, Colt got Eli started on his riding lessons. Margaret watched from the porch as he taught the boy how to saddle Daisy, explaining each step with patient detail. Eli struggled with the heavy saddle, but Colt didn't do it for him, just adjusted his grip and encouraged him to try again until he got it right. Then came the mounting and Eli's first real ride. Margaret held her breath as the boy settled into the saddle, his face a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Colt kept one hand on Daisy's bridle, leading her in slow circles around the corral, talking constantly in that low, calm voice. "That's it. Sit up straight. Heels down. Don't grip with your knees. You'll wear yourself out. Let your weight settle into the stirrups. Good. That's real good, Eli. You're a natural." By the time the lesson ended, an hour later, Eli was glowing with pride despite his sore muscles. He could barely walk straight as he unsaddled Daisy, Colt insisting he complete the whole process himself. But he didn't complain once. "Tomorrow, we'll go a little longer," Colt said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Few weeks of this, and you'll be riding like you were born in the saddle." The days fell into a rhythm after that, each one building on the last. Mornings were for book learning, reading, writing, arithmetic, with Margaret discovering that Eli had a quick mind when properly engaged. Afternoons were for ranch work, with Colt teaching the boy everything from riding to roping to the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. But it was the evenings that became Margaret's favorite time. After supper, they would gather around the fireplace, and Margaret would read aloud while Colt mended tack or carved wood, and Eli struggled to stay awake, fighting exhaustion to hear the end of whatever story she was telling. She read them everything: adventure stories, poetry, even bits of history and science. Colt listened as intently as Eli, though he pretended to be focused on his work. One evening, about a week into their new life, Colt surprised them both by pulling out a harmonica and playing. The music was simple, mostly old folk songs and cattle drive tunes, but it filled the cabin with warmth. Eli begged to learn, and Colt patiently taught him the basics, praising each note the boy managed to coax from the instrument. Margaret watched them, her sewing forgotten in her lap, and felt something shift inside her. This was what family felt like, not the formal, rigid structure she'd grown up with in Boston, but something more fluid and genuine. Three people who'd been alone finding comfort in each other's presence, building something new from their shared loneliness. As the weeks passed, the awkwardness between the three of them gradually eased. Colt grew more comfortable with having people in his space, and Margaret learned to read his moods, when he needed silence, when he was open to conversation, when something was bothering him that he wouldn't voice without prompting. Eli blossomed like a plant finally given water and sunlight, filling out physically as regular meals did their work, and growing in confidence as he mastered new skills. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were challenges, moments of friction that tested their fragile new bond. The first real conflict came about 3 weeks in, when Eli snuck out early one morning to practice his riding alone. Margaret woke to find his loft empty, and panic seized her. She woke Colt, and they found the boy in the corral with Daisy, trying to mount without supervision. Colt's face was thunderous as he strode across the yard. "Eli Turner, what in blazes do you think you're doing?" Eli froze, one foot in the stirrup. "I just wanted to practice. I didn't think—" "No, you didn't think!" Colt's voice cracked like a whip, and Margaret was startled by the anger in it. "You don't ride alone until I say you're ready. You understand me? Horses are dangerous, boy. You make a mistake, you could break your neck, and we wouldn't even know you were hurt until it was too late." "I'm sorry," Eli whispered, tears starting in his eyes. "I didn't mean to." "I don't care what you meant. I care about keeping you safe. Now get down from there." Eli dismounted, his face crumbling, and ran past them toward the cabin. Margaret started to follow, but Colt caught her arm. "Let him go. He needs to sit with what he did wrong." "He made a mistake," Margaret said, pulling free. "He's a child, Colt. Children make mistakes, and they need to learn from them. I'm not going to coddle him into thinking he can do whatever he wants without consequences." "There's a difference between teaching consequences and frightening him." Margaret's own temper flared now. You scared him half to death just now. Was that really necessary? Yes, Colt said flatly. Because if I don't scare him now, the horse might kill him later. This ain't Boston, Margaret. Out here, mistakes can be fatal. He needs to understand that. They stood glaring at each other, and Margaret realized this was their first real argument. The first time their different approaches to raising Eli had come into direct conflict. Fine, she said stiffly, but I'm going to check on him, because someone needs to. She found Eli in his loft, face buried in his pillow, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Margaret climbed up and sat beside him, her hand gentle on his back. I'm sorry, Eli choked out. I didn't mean to make him angry. I just wanted to show him I could do it, that I was learning, that I was worth... Oh, Eli, Margaret's heart broke. You don't have to prove your worth to us. You have nothing to prove. But what if I mess up too much? What if he decides I'm too much trouble and sends me away? So that was the real fear. Margaret should have seen it coming. A child who'd been abandoned, rejected, told he was worthless. Of course he would think any mistake might cost him this new home. Eli, look at me. She waited until his tear-stained face turned toward her. Mr. Colt was angry because he was scared. He was scared you might get hurt. That's not the same as not wanting you here. Do you understand? But I made him so mad. Because he cares about you. People don't get that angry about someone's safety unless they care very much. He's not going to send you away. Neither of us is. This is your home now for keeps, but we need you to be safe, which means following the rules even when you don't like them. Eli nodded slowly, sniffling. I should apologize to him. That would be good, but maybe give him a little time to calm down first. An hour later, Margaret found Colt in the barn, mucking out stalls with more force than necessary. She leaned against the door frame, watching him work. He's terrified you're going to send him away, she said without preamble. Colt's shovel paused mid-swing. What? Eli. He thinks that because he made you angry, you'll decide he's too much trouble. That's why he's so upset, not because you yelled, but because he thinks he might lose this home. Colt set down the shovel and wiped his forehead. That's ridiculous. One mistake doesn't... He stopped, understanding dawning. He doesn't know that, does he? In his experience, one mistake is all it takes. Exactly. Damn. Colt leaned against the stall door, his anger deflating into something more complicated. I didn't mean to scare him like that. When I saw him up on that horse alone, I thought about all the ways it could go wrong. Thought about finding him hurt or worse, and You panicked, Margaret supplied gently, because you care about him. I understand that, Colt, but he needs to understand it too. He needs to hear you say that you were scared for him, not disappointed in him. Colt nodded slowly. I'll talk to him. After chores. And Margaret? He met her eyes. Thanks. For understanding. For helping me understand. That evening, after supper, Colt asked Eli to come outside with him. Margaret watched from the window as they sat together on the porch steps, Colt's hands working a piece of leather while he talked. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw Eli's posture gradually relax, saw him lean against Colt's shoulder, and saw the cowboy's arm come up to hold him close. When they came back inside, Eli's eyes were red, but his smile was genuine. Mr. Colt says I can go back to riding tomorrow, but only with supervision until he says I'm ready for solo rides. That sounds fair, Margaret said. And he says... Eli's voice wobbled. He says even if I make 100 mistakes, even if I mess up every single day, he's not sending me anywhere. Said I'm his, and that's that. That's right, Colt confirmed quietly. That's exactly right. The incident marked a turning point. They'd weathered their first real conflict and come through it intact, maybe even stronger. Eli seemed more secure after that, more willing to make mistakes and ask questions without fear. And Colt and Margaret learned to communicate better, to check with each other before making decisions about the boy, to present a united front even when they disagreed privately. As spring deepened into summer, the ranch work intensified. There was fence mending, cattle branding, hay cutting, and 100 other tasks. Margaret found herself taking on more of the household work to free Colt and Eli for the outdoor labor. She learned to bake bread, to preserve vegetables, to make soap and candles, and all the things a ranch wife would know. She caught herself sometimes thinking that phrase, ranch wife, and had to remind herself that she wasn't Colt's wife. She was just, what? His partner in raising Eli? His housekeeper? The lines were blurry and getting blurrier as the days passed, because somewhere along the way, without either of them quite meaning for it to happen, things had begun to change between them. It started with small things. The way Colt's eyes would linger on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way her heart would skip when his hand accidentally brushed hers while reaching for the same dish. The comfortable silences that stretched between them, heavy with unspoken awareness. One evening in late June, after Eli had gone to bed, Margaret and Colt sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. The air was soft and warm, thick with the scent of honeysuckle and cut hay. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and cattle lowed in response. "I've been thinking," Colt said slowly, not looking at her, "about hiring some help. Ranch is getting to be more than I can manage with just me and Eli. Thought maybe I'd bring on a hand or two for the busy season." "That makes sense," Margaret agreed. "You've been working yourself ragged. Been thinking about other things too." His voice was careful, controlled. "About the future. About what happens as Eli gets older, needs more than just the two of us can give him." Margaret's heart began to pound, though she couldn't have said why. "What do you mean?" Colt was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then finally, "About whether this arrangement we've got is sustainable long term. About whether it's fair to you, living out here without any real claim or security." "I have enough security," Margaret said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I have a home, work that matters. A child to teach and care for. That's more than I had before." "But what about what you want?" Colt turned to look at her now, his eyes serious in the starlight. "What about a real life, Margaret? Marriage, children of your own, a proper place in the world?" Margaret's breath caught. Was he asking what she thought he was asking? Or was he suggesting she leave, find those things elsewhere? "I'm content here," she said carefully. "If you're worried that I'm unhappy or feel trapped, that's not what I'm saying." Colt ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm saying it wrong. What I mean is, these past months, having you here, watching you with Eli, the way you've made this place feel like a home instead of just a house. Margaret, A scream cut through the night, high and terrified. "Eli." They both bolted to their feet and raced inside. Colt took the loft ladder in 3 bounds, while Margaret lit a lamp with shaking hands. She could hear Colt's voice, low and soothing, and Eli's sobbing breaths. "Just a nightmare, son. You're all right. You're safe. I've got you." When Colt climbed down a few minutes later, Eli clinging to him like a burr, the boy's face was pale and streaked with tears. "I dreamed you left me," Eli whispered. "Both of you. I woke up and the cabin was empty and I was alone again, and nobody cared, and... Hey! Margaret came to them, wrapping her arms around both Eli and Colt. "We're right here. We're not going anywhere." "Promise?" Eli's voice was small and broken. "Promise you won't leave?" "I promise," Margaret said firmly. "I'm staying right here for as long as you need me. Longer." "Me too," Colt added. "Eli, you're stuck with us now. For better or worse, through nightmares and all the rest. We're your family. That means we stay. Understand?" Eli nodded against Colt's shoulder, and Margaret felt tears prick her own eyes. The moment she'd shared with Colt on the porch was gone, interrupted, but maybe that was for the best. Whatever he'd been about to say, whatever question had been forming, this wasn't the time. They got Eli settled back in his loft, both of them staying until his breathing evened out into sleep. When they finally retreated to the main room, the earlier intimacy of the evening had shifted into something more complicated. "I should get some rest," Margaret said quietly. "It's late." "Margaret, wait." Colt caught her hand gently. "What I was trying to say before, It's all right," she interrupted, not ready to hear it, not sure what she wanted him to say. "We can talk another time, when things are calmer." She slipped into her bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it with her heart racing. Out in the main room, she heard Colt moving around, banking the fire, settling into his bedroll. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the wild flutter of her pulse, and wondered what she was doing. She'd come here to help a child, to give Eli a chance at a better life. But somewhere along the way, she'd started wanting more. Started noticing the strength in Colt's hands, the kindness in his eyes, the dry humor that surfaced when he was relaxed. Started imagining what it might be like if this arrangement became something more permanent, more real. It was foolish, dangerous. She was letting her heart get tangled up in something that was supposed to be practical, an arrangement for Eli's benefit. But as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Margaret couldn't quite convince herself that practical was all this had ever been. Not when her hands trembled every time Colt smiled at her. Not when she caught herself watching him work, admiring the sure, competent way he handled everything from fractious horses to frightened children. Not when the thought of leaving this place, this life, made her chest ache with a loss she hadn't even experienced yet. Outside her door, Colt lay awake too, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. He'd nearly told her tonight, nearly admitted that he'd fallen for her, that she'd become essential to him in ways that had nothing to do with Eli and everything to do with her laugh, her gentle firmness, the way she made the world seem less harsh just by being in it. But the moment had passed, and maybe that was for the best. She deserved better than a rough cowboy with nothing to offer but hard work and a remote ranch. She deserved education and culture, and a life that didn't involve mucking stalls and mending clothes worn to threads. Still, he couldn't shake the memory of her arms around him when they'd comforted Eli, the three of them tangled together like they were already what he wished they could be. A real family, bound by more than circumstance and good intentions. Above him in the loft, Eli slept peacefully now, his nightmares banished by the knowledge that he was loved and wanted. And in that, at least, Colt could find satisfaction. Whatever else might happen between him and Margaret, they'd given this boy something precious. A home, stability, the security of knowing he mattered. The rest, whatever might or might not develop between two lonely adults who'd found unexpected comfort in each other, would have to wait for another day, another conversation, another moment of courage. For now, it was enough to lie in the darkness and know that he wasn't alone anymore. That just beyond that bedroom door was a woman who'd trusted him enough to risk everything on an impulsive promise. That up in the loft was a boy who called him Mr. Colt, with such affection it made his throat tight. It was enough. It had to be enough. Even if his heart was beginning to whisper that he wanted more. Summer deepened across the Texas hill country, bringing with it long golden days and warm nights filled with cricket song. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts, the cattle growing fat on good grass, the garden Margaret had planted yielding tomatoes and beans and squash. Eli had grown at least 2 inches and filled out enough that his cheekbones no longer jutted sharply from his face. He rode Daisy with confidence now, could rope a fence post 3 times out of 5, and read well enough that Margaret had started him on more advanced texts. But beneath the surface harmony, tension simmered between the two adults. Ever since that interrupted conversation on the porch, something had shifted. They were more careful around each other now, more aware. Their hands never accidentally touched anymore because they were both consciously avoiding it. Their conversations stayed safely impersonal, focused on Eli or the ranch or the weather, never straying into dangerous territory. It was Eli who finally forced the issue, though he didn't mean to. It happened on a Saturday in late July, during their weekly trip to town for supplies. They'd fallen into the habit of going together, the 3 of them, making it an outing that Eli looked forward to all week. This time, as they browsed the general store, Eli had wandered over to look at the candy jars while Colt settled accounts with Morrison and Margaret examined fabric. An older woman Margaret didn't recognize approached Eli, all sharp eyes and sharper tongue. "Well now, aren't you the Turner orphan? Heard you'd run off when Mrs. Halstead died. Caused quite the scandal." Eli's face flushed, but he lifted his chin. "I got a home now. A real home." "Oh?" The woman's gaze cut to Colt and Margaret across the store. "With that cowboy and the dismissed teacher, I suppose. Living out there in sin, from what I hear. What kind of home is that for a child?" Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as several other customers turned to stare. Colt had gone very still, his hand frozen in the act of counting coins, But before either of them could respond, Eli spoke up, his young voice ringing clear and fierce. "It's the best home I've ever had. Mr. Colt and Miss Margaret, they care about me. They feed me and teach me and make sure I'm safe. That's more than anybody else ever did, including Mrs. Halstead with all her praying and rules. So I don't care what you think about it. I don't care what anybody thinks." "Well, I never," the woman sputtered. "That's enough." Colt's voice cut through the store like a knife, quiet but unmistakable in its authority. He crossed to Eli and put a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Ma'am, I suggest you mind your own business. What happens at my ranch is no concern of yours." "The whole town is talking about it," the woman said primly. "An unmarried man and a woman living together, raising a child without any legal—" "The whole town can talk itself blue in the face," Colt interrupted. "Won't change a thing. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have shopping to finish." He steered Eli toward the door, and Margaret quickly gathered her parcels and followed, her face burning with humiliation. The ride back to the ranch was tense and silent. Eli wedged between them on the wagon seat, deflated after his brave defense. When they reached home and unloaded the supplies, Eli disappeared to the barn to tend Daisy. Colt stood in the yard, hands on his hips, staring at nothing. Margaret busied herself putting away the groceries, her hands shaking slightly. "Margaret," Colt appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk." "I know." She set down the sack of flour, not looking at him. "I know what you're going to say. That maybe this was a mistake. That the gossip will hurt Eli. That perhaps I should find somewhere else." "What? No." Colt crossed the room in 3 strides. "That's not what I'm saying at all. Margaret, look at me." She finally met his eyes, surprised to find them fierce and determined rather than regretful. "What that woman said in town, she wasn't entirely wrong. This situation we've created, it's unconventional. People are going to talk, and that talk might affect Eli eventually. Might affect you too." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "So I think we should fix it." Margaret's heart sank. "I don't see how we can fix gossip. We can get married." The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through Margaret's entire body. She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" Colt ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking uncertain. "I'm saying it all wrong again. Look, I know this wasn't part of the original plan. You came here to help with Eli, and that's what you've done, more than I ever could have hoped. But these past months, having you here, Margaret, you've become more than just Eli's teacher. You've become—" He stopped, struggling for words. "You matter to me, a lot. And I think, I hope, that maybe I matter to you too." Margaret's legs felt weak. She groped for a chair and sat down heavily. "You're proposing marriage, to stop gossip." "No, I mean, yes, that's part of it, but—" Colt crouched in front of her, his hands on the armrests of her chair, caging her in gently. "I'm proposing marriage because I want to. Because I care about you, Margaret. Because I wake up grateful you're here and go to sleep, hoping you'll still be here in the morning. Because when I imagine the future, you're in it. You and Eli both." "Colt," her voice came out barely a whisper. "I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm just a cowboy with a small ranch and rough manners. I can't offer you fancy things or city life, but I can offer you a home, security, and—" his voice dropped lower, "and a heart that's yours if you want it. Have wanted it for a while now, if I'm being honest." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. All these weeks of careful distance, of not letting herself hope, and he'd been feeling the same things she had. "I thought you were just being kind, offering me a place because of Eli. Started that way, maybe. Didn't stay that way." His eyes searched hers. "Tell me I'm not alone in this. Tell me you feel something too, even if it's just a possibility." She thought about lying, about protecting herself from potential heartbreak, but she'd spent too many years being careful, being proper, denying what she really wanted for fear of what others might think. "You're not alone," she said quietly. "I feel it too. Have for weeks now. I just didn't dare to hope." Colt's face broke into a smile so warm and genuine it transformed him. "Then marry me. Not because of gossip or propriety, but because you want to. Because we could be good together, the 3 of us. A real family, bound by choice, and—" He hesitated, then plunged ahead. And love, if you'll have it. Love, Margaret repeated, testing the word. Did she love him? She thought of the way her heart lifted when she heard his boots on the porch at day's end, the way his rare smiles made her feel like she'd won something precious, the way his patience with Eli made her chest ache with tenderness, the way she'd come to rely on his steady presence, his quiet strength, his fundamental decency. Yes, she loved him, had been falling in love with him slowly all summer, too afraid to acknowledge it even to herself. Yes, she said, and watched his eyes widen with hope and disbelief. Yes, Colt, I'll marry you. For a moment he just stared at her as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. Then he was pulling her up from the chair and into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart pounding against hers. His hand cradled the back of her head, and she felt his breath shudder out against her hair. You mean it? His voice was rough with emotion. You're sure? I'm sure. Margaret pulled back just enough to see his face. I've never been more sure of anything. Colt's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I'm going to try my damnedest to make you happy, Margaret, to give you the kind of life you deserve. You already have, she whispered, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first and then deeper, a kiss that tasted of promise and possibility and coming home. They broke apart at the sound of the barn door slamming. Eli was heading back toward the cabin, and they quickly stepped apart, both flushed and slightly breathless. The boy burst through the door, then stopped short, looking between them with a puzzled expression. Did something happen? You both look weird. Colt cleared his throat. Actually, son, something did happen. Miss Margaret and I, we've been talking, and we've decided— He glanced at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. We're going to get married. Eli's eyes went wide. Married? You mean like for real married? Like husband and wife? That's what married means, Colt said with a slight smile. But that means— Eli's face lit up like sunrise. That means we really are a family. A real one. Forever. That's right, Margaret said, kneeling to his level. If that's all right with you. All right with me? Eli launched himself at both of them, nearly knocking them over. It's the best thing ever. Can I call you Ma and Pa now? Can I, please? Margaret felt her throat tighten. I'd like that very much. Me too, Colt added, his voice suspiciously gruff. They stood there in the cabin, the three of them wrapped in each other's arms, and Margaret thought this must be what wholeness felt like. After so many years of feeling like a piece that didn't quite fit anywhere, she'd finally found her place. They married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Sweetwater Creek, with the minister's wife and the sheriff standing as witnesses. Margaret wore a simple dress in pale blue that she'd sewn herself from fabric Colt had bought her, and Eli stood proudly beside them in his Sunday best, clutching the ring that Colt would slide onto Margaret's finger. The ceremony was brief and simple, but when Colt said "I do" and looked at her with such open tenderness, Margaret felt like the luckiest woman in Texas. She said her own vows clearly and firmly, meaning every word, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Colt's kiss was both chaste and full of promise. They had a quiet celebration at the ranch that evening, just the three of them. Margaret had made a special supper: fried chicken, biscuits, greens from the garden, and a cake that Eli pronounced the best thing he'd ever tasted. After the meal, Colt surprised them both by presenting Eli with a gift wrapped in brown paper. What is it? Eli asked, tearing into the wrapping. Well, now that we're officially a family, figured you should have proof. Colt watched as Eli pulled out a leather-bound book. It's a family Bible. See there on the first page? That's where you record births and marriages and such. I've already put in our wedding today, Colt Dawson and Margaret Hale. And right under that, I put your name, Eli Dawson, adopted son. Eli stared at the page, his finger tracing the carefully written words. Dawson, he whispered. I'm really a Dawson now. You really are. Have been since the day we brought you home, far as I'm concerned. But now it's official. You're mine. Margaret's ours. Nothing's ever going to change that. Eli's tears came then, but they were happy ones, accompanied by a smile so wide it seemed to split his face. I got a real name. A family name. I belong somewhere. You belong here, Margaret said, pulling him close. You belong with us. Always. That night, after Eli had finally gone to sleep, exhausted from excitement and cake, Margaret stood in the bedroom that was now truly hers to share, nervous in a way she hadn't expected. She'd changed into her nightgown, braided her hair, and now sat on the edge of the bed wondering what happened next. The door opened quietly and Colt stepped in, still fully dressed. He looked almost as nervous as she felt. "I can sleep out in the main room tonight," he said quietly. "If you need more time." "No pressure, Margaret. We can take this as slow as you want." She looked at this man who'd shown her nothing but respect and kindness, who'd given her a home and a family and his name without asking for anything in return. And she realized she didn't want slow. She'd spent enough of her life being careful and cautious. This was her husband, chosen freely, and she wanted to start their life together properly. "Stay," she said softly. "Please stay." Colt's expression shifted, relief and desire mixing with tenderness. He crossed to her slowly, giving her time to change her mind. But Margaret didn't waver. When he sat beside her on the bed, she turned to face him. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "I don't really know. That is, I've never—" "Neither have I," Colt said, surprising her. "Not like this. Not with someone who matters." He kissed her then, gentle and patient, and Margaret felt the last of her nervousness ease away. This was right. They were right. Whatever they didn't know, they would figure out together. The weeks that followed their wedding brought a new ease to the household. The awkward tension that had marked the summer dissipated, replaced by genuine intimacy and partnership. Margaret moved her belongings into the main bedroom, and Colt's bedroll disappeared from in front of the fireplace. They fell into the rhythms of married life with surprising naturalness, learning each other's habits and preferences, negotiating the small compromises that sharing a life required. Eli noticed the change immediately and seemed to blossom even more under the security of their official union. He called them Ma and Pa now, without hesitation, and his nightmares became less frequent, then stopped altogether. He worked harder at his lessons, knowing that his place here wasn't temporary or conditional. This was his family, his home, forever. But their newfound happiness was tested sooner than any of them expected. It came in early October, when the first real cold snap of autumn arrived. Colt had been out checking cattle in the north pasture, making sure they were all accounted for before the weather turned. He'd taken Eli with him, teaching the boy to track and count, essential skills for any rancher. They'd been gone since dawn, and Margaret expected them back by mid-afternoon. But the sun sank lower and lower, and still they didn't return. By the time darkness fell, Margaret was pacing the porch anxiously, scanning the horizon for any sign of them. Finally, just as she was about to saddle Bessie and go looking herself, she heard hoofbeats. But only one horse came into view, and her heart plummeted when she saw it was Daisy, with Eli riding double behind someone else. Not Colt. As they drew closer, Margaret realized it was Tom Bennett, their nearest neighbor, and he was holding Eli steady in the saddle. The boy looked pale and frightened. "Mrs. Dawson," Tom called as he rode up. "Found the boy on the ridge trail. Says Colt's hurt." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Hurt? How bad?" "Don't know. Boy says his horse spooked at a snake, threw him hard, hit his head on a rock. Eli came for help." "Where is he?" Margaret was already moving toward the barn, her mind racing. "West Ridge, near the creek crossing. I've got lanterns and rope in my saddlebag. We need to go now before it gets full dark and we lose the trail." "I'm coming with you." Margaret's voice left no room for argument. "Ma, I can show you where—" Eli started, but Margaret cut him off. "No, you stay here. Keep the fire going, keep the house warm. We'll bring him back." She turned to Tom. "How long has he been out there?" "Maybe 2 hours, near as I can figure. Boy rode hard to get help." 2 hours. 2 hours alone in the cold, injured, possibly bleeding. Margaret fought down panic as she helped Tom saddle a fresh horse. She threw on Colt's heavy coat and grabbed blankets and the first aid supplies she kept in the house. The ride to the West Ridge felt eternal, though it probably only took 30 minutes. Tom led the way with a lantern, following Eli's directions, and Margaret's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Please let him be all right. Please let us find him in time. Please, please, please. They found him exactly where Eli had said, slumped against a boulder near the creek crossing. His horse stood nearby, reins trailing, apparently having calmed down after throwing its rider. In the lamplight, Margaret could see blood matting Colt's hair on one side, and his face was pale as milk. "Colt!" She threw herself from the horse before it had fully stopped and scrambled to his side. "Colt, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Margaret, what are you... Why are you... You were thrown. You're hurt. We're going to get you home." She examined the wound on his head as gently as she could, relieved to find it wasn't as deep as she'd feared, though he'd have a hell of a goose egg. "Can you stand?" I think so." With Tom's help, they got Colt to his feet, though he swayed dangerously and had to lean heavily on both of them. "Definitely got his bell rung," Tom observed. "Probably concussed. We need to get him home and keep him awake tonight, make sure it's not serious." Getting Colt onto his horse was an ordeal, and Margaret ended up riding behind him to hold him steady, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back so she could monitor his breathing. The ride back seemed even longer than the ride out, every jolt and sway making her wince in sympathy. Eli burst out of the cabin the moment he heard the horses, his face a mask of worry. "Pa, is he all right? Is he gonna die?" "He's not going to die," Margaret said firmly, though fear still gripped her heart. "He's just hurt. Help us get him inside." Between the three of them, they managed to get Colt into the cabin and onto the bed. Margaret immediately set to cleaning the wound on his head, while Tom built up the fire and Eli heated water. Colt drifted in and out of full consciousness, murmuring things that didn't quite make sense. "Stay with me," Margaret commanded, patting his cheek when his eyes started to close. "Colt Dawson, you stay awake, you hear me? I didn't marry you just to have you die on me 2 months later." His eyes opened, and this time the focus was a little better. "Margaret, you all right?" "I'm fine. You're the one who decided to go flying off your horse like a greenhorn." "Snake," he mumbled. "Big rattler. Storm spooked, threw me before I could get him settled." "I know, Eli told us." "It's all right. You're going to be fine." Tom stayed for another hour, helping Margaret watch over Colt and making sure he stayed conscious. Finally, satisfied that the danger had passed, he took his leave. "Keep waking him through the night," he advised. "Don't let him sleep more than an hour at a time. If he starts vomiting or can't recognize you, ride for the doctor immediately." After Tom left, Margaret sent Eli to bed, though she doubted the boy would sleep much. Then she settled in for the long night of keeping watch over her husband. Colt drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes knowing exactly where he was and who she was, other times confused and disoriented. During one of his clearer moments, he reached for her hand. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "Scared you. Didn't mean to." "I know you didn't." Margaret's voice was thick with emotion she'd been holding back. "But Colt, when I saw you lying there, when I thought you might be, I realized how much I need you, not just for Eli, but for me. I can't lose you." "Not planning on going anywhere." His hand tightened on hers. "Promised you forever. Still mean it." "Good. Because I'm holding you to that promise." She woke him every hour through the night, checking his pupils, asking him simple questions to make sure his mind was clear. Each time he was a little more coherent, a little more himself. And by dawn, the worst of her fear had passed. When morning light finally spilled through the windows, Eli crept downstairs and peeked into the bedroom. "Ma, is he?" "He's all right," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "He's going to be fine." Eli's face crumpled with relief, and he crawled into the bed on Colt's other side, careful not to jostle his injured father. Colt's arm came up automatically to hold the boy close. "Sorry I scared you, son," he murmured. "That was a damn fool thing, letting Storm throw me like that." "Don't care," Eli said fiercely. "Just glad you're alive. When I saw you lying there, not moving, I thought, I know, but I'm tough to kill. Gonna take more than a rattlesnake and a hard landing to keep me down." Margaret watched them together, her husband and her son, and felt the fear of the night crystallize into something else, something fierce and protective and all-consuming. This was her family. These two people were hers to love and protect, and she would do anything, anything, to keep them safe. Colt spent 3 days recovering, during which Margaret fussed over him relentlessly, and Eli barely left his side. By the 4th day, he was itching to get back to work, though Margaret insisted he take it easy. "The cattle can wait another day," she said firmly when he tried to get up at dawn. "You're not fully healed yet." "I'm fine, woman. Stop coddling me." "I'll coddle you if I want to. You're my husband, and I nearly lost you, so you'll stay in this bed until I say otherwise." Colt looked at her, his capable, determined wife who'd ridden through the dark to find him, who'd stayed awake all night to keep watch over him, who'd faced her fear and turned it into fierce protection, and felt his heart swell with love so intense it almost hurt. "Come here," he said quietly. Margaret moved closer, suspicious. "If you think you're charming your way out of bed rest." He pulled her down beside him and kissed her thoroughly. "I love you," he said when they broke apart. "Haven't said it enough. Should say it more. I love you, Margaret Dawson. Love you something fierce." Her eyes went bright with tears. "I love you too. So much it terrifies me sometimes. When I thought I might lose you. You won't. I'm too stubborn, and you're too determined to let me go. We're stuck with each other now." "Good," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "That's exactly how I want it." They lay there together as the morning sun warmed the room, and from the loft they could hear Eli stirring, Buck's tail thumping the floor as the boy woke. This was their life now, full of work and worry, of small joys and sudden scares, of love that had crept up on them quietly and then taken root so deep nothing could shake it loose. It wasn't the life Margaret had imagined for herself back in Boston, teaching proper young ladies in a proper school. It wasn't the lonely existence Colt had resigned himself to after Jack's death. It was better. Messier and scarier and more complicated, but infinitely better. Because they had each other. And as long as that remained true, they could face anything the Texas wilderness threw at them. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north with winds that rattled the cabin windows and turned the grass silver with frost. By November, the hills wore a coat of white more often than not, and the cattle huddled together in the sheltered valleys, their breath making clouds in the cold air. Inside the cabin, though, warmth radiated from the fireplace and from the family gathered around it. Margaret sat in the rocking chair with her sewing, working on a new shirt for Eli, who seemed to grow an inch every time she turned around. Colt was at the table, showing the boy how to work leather, their heads bent together over a bridle that needed mending. Buck lay stretched before the fire, twitching occasionally in his sleep as he dreamed of chasing rabbits. It was an ordinary evening, peaceful and domestic, the kind that Margaret had come to treasure. But she carried a secret tonight, something she'd been holding close for the past week, waiting for the right moment to share. She watched her husband and son working together, their easy camaraderie, the way Eli hung on Colt's every word, and felt her heart swell with love and anticipation. "Eli," she said finally, setting down her sewing, "why don't you take Buck out for his evening run? He's been cooped up all day." Eli looked up, surprised. "But it's cold out there, Ma." "Then wear your heavy coat. The dog needs exercise, and so do you. You've been sitting too long." The boy recognized the tone, the one that meant his mother wanted privacy for adult conversation. He gathered Buck and bundled into his coat, shooting curious glances at both his parents before heading out into the cold evening. Colt watched him go, then turned to Margaret with a slight smile. "That wasn't subtle." "I wasn't trying to be subtle." Margaret set aside her sewing and moved to the table, sitting across from him. Her hands trembled slightly, and she folded them in her lap to hide it. "I need to tell you something." His expression shifted immediately to concern. "What's wrong? Are you sick? Did something happen?" "Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think it's wrong. I hope you won't think it's wrong." She was babbling, nervous in a way she hadn't been since she'd accepted his proposal. "Colt, I'm with child." For a moment, he just stared at her, his hands frozen on the leather he'd been working. Then his eyes went wide with wonder and something that looked like fear. You're certain?" "As certain as I can be. I've missed my courses twice now, and I've been feeling sick in the mornings and—" She gestured vaguely. I know the signs, Colt. I'm going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby. Colt stood abruptly, his chair scraping back, and for a terrible moment Margaret thought he was going to walk away, that this was too much, that she'd somehow miscalculated what he wanted from their marriage. But then he was around the table and pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "Margaret, we're gonna have a baby. You're happy?" She pulled back to see his face. "You're not angry or worried or happy doesn't even begin to cover it." His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Scared half to death, but happy. Margaret, I never thought, after everything, I never imagined I'd have this. A wife, a son, and now," his voice broke slightly, "now another child, a baby to raise from the beginning." "I'm scared too," Margaret admitted. "Childbirth is dangerous out here, so far from doctors, and we'll manage. We'll get through it together." Colt's jaw set with determination. "I'll ride to town tomorrow, talk to the midwife. Make sure she knows to be ready when your time comes. And we'll prepare, stock up on supplies. Make sure you have everything you need." "It won't be until spring," Margaret said. "Late April or early May, I think. Then we have time." He kissed her softly, reverently, as if she'd become something precious and fragile. "Time to get ready. Time to tell Eli. Time for me to stop panicking." Margaret laughed despite her own nerves. "You're panicking?" Terrified. "What do I know about babies? At least with Eli he was already 10, could talk and feed himself and use the privy. A baby is just tiny and helpless and completely dependent. What if I do it wrong? Then we'll figure it out together, just like we've figured out everything else." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "This child is already so loved, Colt, by both of us. That's the most important thing." They stood like that for a long moment, Colt's hand warm on her belly, both of them imagining the life growing there. Then the door burst open and Eli tumbled in with Buck, both of them covered in snow. "It started snowing again," the boy announced, shaking snow from his hair. "Big fat flakes coming down real heavy. Buck tried to eat them and—" He stopped, noticing their position, the way they were looking at each other. "What? What happened? Did I miss something?" Margaret and Colt exchanged glances, and she nodded. Might as well tell him now. "Come here, son," Colt said, and Eli approached warily, probably expecting to be scolded for tracking snow inside. "We've got some news, good news. Your ma and I, we're going to have a baby. You're going to be a big brother." Eli's mouth dropped open. For a long moment, he just stood there, processing, and Margaret held her breath, suddenly worried about how he'd take it. Would he feel replaced? Jealous? Would this threaten the security they'd worked so hard to build? Then Eli's face split into the widest grin she'd ever seen. "A baby? Really? A real baby? Like tiny and everything?" "That's generally how babies work," Colt said with a slight smile. "When? When does it get here?" "Not until spring," Margaret said. "It takes time for a baby to grow." Spring. Eli was already planning, his mind racing ahead. "We'll have to make sure the cabin's extra warm and maybe build a cradle, and I can help take care of it, right? I can be a good big brother. I'll teach it everything I know about horses and roping and—" "Slow down," Margaret laughed, relief flooding through her. "The baby won't be doing any riding or roping for quite a while. But yes, you can help. You'll be very important." Eli threw his arms around both of them, and they stood in a three-way embrace while snow continued to fall outside and the fire crackled warm and bright. This was their family, Margaret thought, and it was about to grow. The idea was both terrifying and wonderful. The winter passed in a flurry of preparation. Colt built a beautiful cradle from oak, carving delicate patterns into the wood during the long evenings. Margaret sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands remembering skills her own mother had taught her years ago. Eli appointed himself chief baby preparer, asking endless questions about what babies needed and how they worked and whether this one would be a boy or a girl. "Don't really matter," Colt said one evening as they all worked on their various projects. "Long as the baby's healthy and your ma comes through it safe, that's all I care about." But Margaret saw the way his hands sometimes paused on the cradle, the distant look in his eyes, and knew he was imagining holding his child, probably hoping for a daughter with dark hair in his eyes, or maybe a son with Margaret's features. The specifics didn't matter. He'd love this child regardless, but she understood the dreams that came with anticipation. Christmas arrived, and they celebrated simply but joyfully. Margaret made a special dinner with supplies Colt had brought from town, a ham that must have cost him dearly, canned peaches, real sugar for cookies. Colt gave Eli a new saddle, sized perfectly for the boy's growing frame, and Margaret gave him books, adventure stories she'd ordered specially. For each other, they exchanged practical gifts wrapped in sentiment. A new shawl for Margaret that Colt had picked out himself, running his rough fingers over the soft wool until the shopkeeper assured him it was the finest they had. A carved pipe for Colt that Margaret had commissioned from a craftsman in town, knowing he'd given up smoking years ago but had always admired the look of a good pipe. But the best gift was simply being together, the three of them safe and warm while snow piled up outside. Eli fell asleep by the fire with his head in Margaret's lap, and Colt carried him to his loft bed before returning to sit with his wife. "Next Christmas there'll be 4 of us," Margaret said softly, her hand on her growing belly. She was starting to show now, her dresses getting snug despite the letting out she'd done. 5, counting Buck, Colt added, and they both smiled. As winter deepened into January and then February, Margaret's pregnancy became more evident. Her energy waned and she found herself needing afternoon rests. Colt took over more of the household chores without complaint, learning to cook basic meals and even attempting bread, though his first efforts were dense enough to use as doorstops. "It's the thought that counts," Margaret said diplomatically, trying to chew through a biscuit that could have doubled as a weapon. "It's terrible, and you know it," Colt said with a laugh. "But I'm learning. By the time this baby comes, I'll be able to feed us all without poisoning anyone." Eli helped too, taking on more responsibilities without being asked. He kept the firewood stocked, fed the chickens, helped with cooking, and read to Margaret in the afternoons when she was tired. He'd grown so much in the past year, physically and emotionally, transforming from a scared, hungry orphan into a confident young man who knew he was loved and valued. One afternoon in late February, as Margaret dozed in the rocking chair and Eli read beside her, Colt came in from working in the barn with a strange expression on his face. "Eli, go check on the horses, would you? Make sure they've got enough water." The boy recognized a dismissal when he heard one and obeyed without argument, though he shot curious glances back as he left. Colt waited until the door closed, then pulled a chair close to Margaret's and took her hand. "What is it?" Margaret asked, suddenly alert. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least I don't think so. He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I rode into town this morning while you were resting. Went to see Judge Morrison about something." Margaret's heart began to pound. "About what?" "About adopting Eli. Legally, officially, making him a Dawson in the eyes of the law, not just in our hearts." Colt pulled papers from his coat pocket. "I've been thinking about it for months, since before the wedding even. But with the baby coming, I wanted to make sure Eli knows, absolutely knows, that he's ours same as any child we have together, that nothing changes for him." Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. "Colt, the judge said we both need to sign, and Eli needs to consent since he's over 10. Then it's official. He'll legally be our son, with all the rights and privileges that come with it, including inheriting the ranch someday." Colt's voice grew rough. "I want him to know he's not just the boy we took in out of charity. He's our son, our first son. And nothing, not the baby, not time, not anything, will ever change that." Margaret couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by love for this man who thought so deeply about a child's heart. "When do we tell him?" "Now, if you're up for it. Together." They called Eli back inside, and the boy came running, probably worried something was wrong with his mother or the baby. His face showed relief when he saw Margaret sitting up and smiling, but confusion when he noticed the papers on the table. "Am I in trouble?" he asked cautiously. "The opposite of trouble," Colt said. "Come sit down, son. We need to talk to you about something important." Eli sat, his eyes darting between them nervously. Margaret reached over and took his hand. "Eli, you know we love you, right?" she began. You know you're our son in every way that matters? Yes, ma'am. His voice was uncertain, clearly not sure where this was going. Well, we want to make it official, Colt said, pushing the papers across the table. These are adoption papers. If you agree, if you want this, we'll sign them and file them with the court. Then you'll legally be Eli Dawson, our adopted son. Not just a boy we're raising, but our actual son. Eli stared at the papers as if they might bite him. But I thought, I already call you Ma and Pa. I already am a Dawson. In our hearts, yes, Margaret said gently. But this makes it legal. It means if anything ever happened to us, you'd inherit the ranch. It means no one can ever question your place in this family. It means you're ours forever, officially. Why now? Eli's voice came out small. Is it because of the baby? Because you want your real child to Stop right there. Colt's voice was firm but not harsh. You are our real child, Eli. Have been since the day I found you outside that store and decided nobody was going to make you feel unwanted ever again. The baby coming doesn't change that one bit. In fact, that's exactly why we're doing this now. To make absolutely sure you understand that you're not being replaced or pushed aside. You're our first son, and that's a special place that belongs only to you. Tears streamed down Eli's face now, but he was smiling. You really mean it? I can really be yours? Forever and official. If you want to be, Margaret said. This has to be your choice, Eli. Do you want us to be your parents? Legally, officially, permanently? Yes! The word burst out of him like he'd been holding it back his entire life. Yes, please. I want that more than anything. Colt pulled out a pen and ink. Then let's make it official. You sign here, your ma and I sign here, and then we take it to the judge. Simple as that. They signed the papers together, Eli's handwriting still a little shaky but legible, his full name written carefully, Eli Turner Dawson. Margaret added her signature, then Colt added his large hand steady and sure. When they were done, Eli stared at the papers with wonder. That's it? I'm really your son now? You were always our son, Colt said. This just makes it so the whole world knows it too. Eli launched himself at both of them, and they held him while he cried happy tears, releasing years of fear and uncertainty. He was home. He was wanted. He belonged. And now he had proof, signed and legal and permanent. Spring arrived gradually, the snow melting to reveal green grass and wildflowers that painted the hills in brilliant colors. Margaret grew larger and slower, her belly now prominent, the baby moving actively inside her. She felt the flutter of tiny kicks and would take Colt's hand and place it where the baby moved, watching his face light up with wonder. Strong one, he'd say, feeling the movements. Gonna be a fighter. Takes after its father, then, Margaret would reply, and Colt would flush with pleasure. As April turned warm and beautiful, they began to prepare in earnest for the birth. Mrs. Henderson, the midwife from town, made a visit to check on Margaret and gave her approval. Baby's positioned well, mother's healthy, should be a straightforward birth, God willing. Send word when her pains start, and I'll come immediately. But as Margaret's due date approached, she grew anxious. Childbirth had killed so many women she'd known. Her own mother had died bringing a stillborn son into the world when Margaret was 15. What if something went wrong? What if she left Colt alone with 2 children and a ranch to manage? What if— Stop, Colt said one night, finding her awake and staring at the ceiling. I can hear you thinking from here, and it's not good thoughts. I'm scared, Margaret admitted. Women die in childbirth all the time, Colt, especially out here, so far from— You're not going to die. His voice was absolute, as if he could command reality itself. I won't let you. We've come too far, built too much. You don't get to leave me now, Margaret Dawson. I won't allow it. Despite her fear, she smiled. You're very bossy for someone who has no control over the situation. Then control it you will. You're the strongest woman I know. You'll get through this because you're stubborn and determined, and you've got 2 people depending on you. 3, counting me. And you don't quit on people who need you. That's not who you are. His faith in her was both comforting and terrifying. But as she lay there with his hand on her belly, feeling their child move beneath his palm, Margaret made a decision. She would fight for this. For the baby, for Eli, for Colt, for the life they'd built together. She would survive because the alternative was unthinkable. The pain started on a warm evening in late April, just as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Margaret was setting the table for supper when the first contraction hit, taking her breath away with its intensity. "Colt!" she gasped, and he was at her side immediately. "It's time? It's time. You need to ride for Mrs. Henderson. Eli, you'll need to—" "I'm not leaving you," Colt said flatly. "Eli can ride for the midwife. He's more than capable. But no arguments. Eli, saddle Daisy and ride fast but safe to town. Bring Mrs. Henderson back. Can you do that?" The boy was already moving, fear and excitement warring on his face. "I can do it, Pa. I'll be fast." He was out the door in moments, and they heard Daisy's hoofbeats fading into the distance. Colt helped Margaret to the bedroom and began gathering the supplies they'd prepared: clean cloths, hot water, everything Mrs. Henderson had told them they'd need. The labor was long and hard. Contractions came in waves, each one stronger than the last, stealing Margaret's breath and making her cry out despite her determination to be brave. Colt stayed by her side through all of it, his hand in hers, his voice low and steady as he talked her through each pain. "You're doing so well, love, so strong. Just breathe through it. That's it. I've got you. You're not alone." Hours passed. Night fell fully, and still no sign of Eli or the midwife. The pains grew closer together, more intense, and Margaret began to panic. "Something's wrong," she gasped between contractions. "The baby should be here by now. Why isn't Mrs. Henderson here? Colt, I'm scared." I know you are. But you're doing fine. The baby's coming, I can tell. We might just have to do this ourselves." "You can't. You don't know how to—" "I've birthed calves and foals," Colt said, with a calmness he clearly didn't feel. "Can't be that different. And you're going to tell me what to do, and we're going to get through this together, just like everything else." Another contraction hit, stronger than all the others, and Margaret felt an overwhelming urge to push. "Colt, the baby's coming now!" He moved to the foot of the bed, his hand steady despite the fear in his eyes. "All right then. When the next pain comes, you push. Push as hard as you can. I've got you, Margaret. We're going to meet our baby." The next few minutes were a blur of pain and effort, and Colt's voice guiding her through it. Margaret pushed with everything she had, pouring all her strength and determination into bringing this child safely into the world. And then, just as she thought she couldn't endure another moment, she heard it. A baby's cry. High and indignant, and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," Colt breathed, his voice full of wonder. "Margaret, we have a daughter." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as Colt carefully cleaned their daughter and wrapped her in soft blankets. He placed the tiny bundle in Margaret's arms, and she looked down at the small red face, the screwed-up eyes, the perfect tiny fingers, and fell completely in love. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." The baby, their daughter, had a shock of dark hair, and when she finally opened her eyes, they were the same gray-blue as her father's. She was perfect and healthy and more beautiful than anything Margaret had ever seen. "You did it," Colt said, his hand gentle on Margaret's hair. "You were amazing, so strong. I'm so proud of you." "We did it," Margaret corrected, looking up at him. "I couldn't have done it without you." They sat like that, the three of them, as dawn began to break outside. And that's how Eli and Mrs. Henderson found them when they finally arrived, rushing in breathless and worried. I'm sorry, Eli gasped. Mrs. Henderson was delivering another baby, and it took so long to— He stopped, seeing the bundle in Margaret's arms. "Is that—" "Come meet your sister," Margaret said softly. Eli approached slowly, almost reverently. When he got close enough to see the baby's face, his expression transformed into pure wonder. "She's so small, so perfect. What's her name?" Colt and Margaret exchanged glances. They'd discussed names over the winter, but now, looking at their daughter, they both knew what felt right. "Hope," Colt said. "Her name is Hope Dawson." "Hope," Eli repeated, testing it. "I like that. That's a good name." He looked up at his parents, his eyes shining. "Can I hold her?" Margaret glanced at Mrs. Henderson, who'd been examining her and pronouncing everything normal, and the midwife nodded with a smile. "Support her head," Margaret instructed as she carefully transferred the baby into Eli's arms. The boy held his sister with exaggerated care, as if she might break. Hope looked up at him with unfocused baby eyes, and Eli grinned. "Hi, Hope. I'm your big brother, Eli. I'm going to teach you everything I know, how to ride horses and read books, and—" His voice cracked slightly. "And I'm going to make sure you always know you're loved and wanted. Promise." Colt wrapped his arm around Margaret, and they watched their son hold their daughter as morning light filled the room. Mrs. Henderson busied herself with cleanup and checking on both mother and baby, pronouncing everyone healthy and praising Colt for his work. "Not many men could do what you did," she said. "You've got steady hands and a cool head, Mr. Dawson." "Just did what needed doing," Colt said, though he looked exhausted now that the crisis had passed. "Wasn't about to let anything happen to either of them." After Mrs. Henderson left with instructions to send for her if anything seemed wrong, the family settled into their new reality. Hope nursed eagerly, much to Margaret's relief, and then fell asleep in the cradle Colt had made. Eli refused to go to his loft, instead curling up on the floor beside the cradle so he could keep watch over his sister. That first day blurred into the next, and then into a week, and then a month. Hope was a good baby, healthy and content, sleeping and eating on a predictable schedule. Eli was a devoted big brother, always wanting to help, to hold her, to make her smile. And Colt was transformed by fatherhood in a way Margaret hadn't expected. She'd known he'd love the baby, of course, but seeing him with Hope was something else entirely. The way his entire face softened when he looked at her, the way he'd walk her around the cabin at night when she was fussy, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice until she settled. The way he'd cradle her against his chest while he worked at the table, one hand busy with some task while the other held his daughter secure. One evening in early summer, Margaret stood at the bedroom door watching the scene in the main room. Eli was reading aloud from one of his books while Hope lay in her father's lap, her tiny hand wrapped around Colt's finger. Buck dozed by the fire, and the whole cabin glowed warm with lamplight and love. Colt looked up and caught her watching, a smile playing at his lips. "What are you thinking about?" "That day in Sweetwater Creek," Margaret said, moving into the room to join them. "When you stopped for a starving boy outside a general store. Did you ever imagine it would lead to this?" "Not in a million years," Colt admitted. "Thought I'd probably just buy him a meal, maybe give him a few coins, and that would be the end of it. Never imagined." He looked around the cabin, at Eli reading, at Hope sleeping in his arms, at Margaret settling beside him. "Never imagined I'd end up with everything I never knew I wanted." "Do you remember what you told me that night?" Eli asked, looking up from his book. "What you said to me when I was sitting there thinking nobody cared?" "I remember," Colt said quietly. "You said, 'I care,' always. And you meant it. You really meant it." Eli's voice was thick with emotion. "You changed my whole life with those 3 words, Pa. Gave me a family, a home, a future, everything." "You changed mine too," Colt replied. "Both of you did. I was just existing before, going through the motions, but you two, and now this little one, you made me start living again, made all this mean something." Margaret leaned against her husband's shoulder, her hand resting on Hope's small back. "We saved each other, I think. All of us. We were all lost in our own ways, and somehow we found our way to each other." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire, and Hope's soft breathing and the occasional turn of a page as Eli continued reading. Outside, the Texas night was alive with summer sounds, crickets and tree frogs, and the distant lowing of cattle. The hills rolled away in darkness, but here in this small cabin, light and warmth and love held back the night. "I've been thinking," Margaret said eventually, "about what to tell Hope when she's old enough to ask about how our family came to be, about how we found each other." "What will you tell her, Sheet?" Colt asked. Margaret considered, her fingers playing with Hope's downy hair. "I'll tell her about a boy who thought nobody cared and a cowboy who proved him wrong, about a teacher who took a chance on an unconventional life, and about how the bravest thing we ever did was choose each other. I'll tell her that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who stop when you need them, who care when it costs them something, who stay even when it's hard. That's good, Eli said softly. That's real good, Ma. And I'll tell her, Colt added, his arm tightening around Margaret, that the measure of a life well lived isn't in how much you accumulate or how comfortable you make yourself. It's in how much you give when it matters, in stopping for someone who needs help, in caring always, even when, especially when, the world says you don't have to. He looked down at Hope, at her perfect sleeping face, and then at Eli, who'd grown so much in the years since that fateful evening in Sweetwater Creek. That's what Jack taught me, and what I hope we're teaching both of you. That kindness isn't weakness, that caring isn't foolish, that sometimes the best thing you can do with your life is open your heart to people who need it, even when it's scary, even when you don't know how it'll turn out. It turned out pretty well, I'd say, Margaret murmured, and Colt smiled. Yeah, it really did. As the evening deepened and Hope woke for her feeding, they moved through the familiar routines of family life. Eli helped bank the fire and prepare for bed. Colt checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Margaret nursed the baby in the rocking chair, humming softly. And slowly, naturally, they all settled into sleep. In his loft, Eli lay beneath his blankets thinking about how different his life was from just a year ago. He'd been alone and hungry and convinced he'd never matter to anyone. Now he had parents who loved him, a baby sister he'd protect with his life, and a home that would always be his. He touched the adoption papers that he kept tucked under his pillow, needing the physical reminder that it was all real, all permanent. In the bedroom, Colt and Margaret lay with Hope in her cradle beside them. Margaret's hand dangled over the side, her fingers resting on the cradle's edge so she'd feel if the baby stirred. Colt's arm was around his wife, holding her close, grateful beyond words for the life they'd built. "Thank you," Margaret whispered in the darkness. "For what?" "For stopping that day. For caring when you didn't have to. For giving me and Eli a home. For loving us." "Thank you for trusting me," Colt replied. "For taking a chance on a rough cowboy who didn't have much to offer except a promise to try." "You offered everything that mattered," Margaret said. "You offered your heart. That's all we needed." They fell asleep like that, surrounded by the breathing of their children, wrapped in the security of promises kept and love freely given. Outside, the Texas stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to human joys and sorrows. But in that cabin, in that valley, a family had been forged from loneliness and loss, and the simple, profound act of stopping when someone needed help. The years would bring their share of challenges, drought and illness, hard winters, and harder decisions. Eli would grow into a fine young man who'd eventually bring home a wife of his own. Hope would grow strong and spirited, learning to ride almost before she could walk, inheriting her father's stubbornness and her mother's sharp mind. There would be other children, too, filling the cabin with noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of a growing family. But always they would remember that first summer when they came together. The boy who said nobody cared, the cowboy who stopped, the teacher who took a leap of faith, and the baby named Hope who completed their circle. On quiet evenings, when the children were grown and gone, when gray had touched both Colt's and Margaret's hair, they would sit on that same porch and watch the sunset over the valley they'd made their own. And Colt would take Margaret's hand, weathered now with years of work and love, and he'd say the words that had started everything. "I care, always." And Margaret would smile, squeezing his hand, and reply with words of her own. I know you do." Because that's what their life had been built on, caring when it cost something, loving when it was hard, staying when it would have been easier to leave. They'd taken broken pieces and made something whole. They'd transformed nobody cares into I care, always. And from those 3 words, a family had grown. Their story would be told around the fire on cold nights, passed down through generations. The story of how love could take root in the most unlikely places. How family could be chosen as well as born. How one moment of compassion could change the course of multiple lives forever. And at the heart of it all would be a simple truth, as relevant in their final years as it had been that first night in Sweetwater Creek. That we save each other. That the bravest thing we can do is open our hearts when the world tells us to close them. That caring, truly, deeply, always caring, is not just the foundation of family, but the foundation of everything worth having in this life. Beneath the vast Texas sky, in a valley where wildflowers bloomed and cattle grazed and children's laughter echoed off the hills, that truth had taken root and flourished. And it would continue long after Colt and Margaret were gone, living on in the hearts of their children and their children's children, a legacy more precious than land or cattle or gold. The legacy of a family built on 3 simple words: I care, always. And they did. They always would.